Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable and relax. If you're listening this, it's already too late. I know you'll judge me, call me a coward for what I've done when you find my lifeless body lying in a pool of blood, but soon you'll understand. My body won't give you the answers you seek. This letter will. It started a month ago, the night I first found her. She was powerless then, just a figment of my imagination, a character from my novella. Before I tell you more, I have to warn you. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. You shouldn't want to know her. I named her Mara. I wanted to create a tale of triumph rising from tragedy. And so I began with tragedy. She grew up in a small, nameless village, her life ordinary and uneventful, until that day. When she was just 8 years old. Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable and relax. If you're listening this, it's already too late. I know you'll judge me, call me a coward for what I've done when you find my lifeless body lying in a pool of blood, but soon you'll understand. My body won't give you the answers you seek. This letter will. It started a month ago, the night I first found her. She was powerless then, just a figment of my imagination, a character from my novella. Before I tell you more, I have to warn you. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. You shouldn't want to know her. I named her Mara. I wanted to create a tale of triumph rising from tragedy. And so I began with tragedy. She grew up in a small, nameless village, her life ordinary and uneventful, until that day. When she was just 8 years old, she came home from school to find the front door ajar. Her parents had fought before, but this time, the silence inside was suffocating. She stepped in and saw her mother lying on the floor, unmoving, a dark crimson pool spreading around her. Her father stood frozen, a bloodied vase still clutched in his hand. For a moment, time stopped. There was no sound, just the faint ringing in Mara's ears as she stared in disbelief. Then the silence broke, shattered by her scream. I know how it sounded because I heard it. That night, it was piercing, raw, and filled with so much pain it made my chest tighten. I thought I was imagining it. A writer too caught up in his own story, I told myself, and I continued to write. Her father had called it an accident. He forced Mara to lie, and when she refused, he beat her. I wrote about her sobs, the way her small body shook under his blows. That night I heard her cry. Soft, muffled sobs that came from nowhere and everywhere. It wouldn't stop. By the second sleepless night, I wanted to quit. The story was taking a toll on me, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me back, like I wasn't in control anymore. So I kept writing. At 14, Mara ran away. She couldn't take it anymore. Her father's rage, his fists, his lies. She spent her first winter on the streets alone. I wrote about her suffering, the way the cold gnawed at her bones, the hunger twisting her stomach, her hollow, desperate eyes. That night I felt the cold seep through my skin, even though my heater was on. I felt the ache of hunger, even though I'd eaten. I heard her breath, so faint but unmistakably there. It was like she wanted me to feel her pain. The more I wrote, the louder she became. Her story bled into my reality, and I started to believe it wasn't just a story anymore. I thought about deleting everything, ending it right there. But I couldn't. A part of me liked it. It made me feel alive. It challenged me. I wanted to push her further, to see how much more she could endure. How much more I could endure. So I kept going. I wrote about the men who found her on the street. They dragged her into the trunk of their car, driving her to a secluded cabin. I wrote how their nails scratched her skin, their cruelty tearing her apart. That night I woke up screaming. I felt nails clawing at my flesh, invisible hands pinning me down. I couldn't fight back. When it was over, I looked at my arms and saw the scratches, deep red welts that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just my imagination anymore. I could see the marks, real, physical, undeniable. I had to stop. But then, she whispered. She told me I couldn't stop. That it wasn't my story, it was hers. I wasn't creating it, I was uncovering it. And the more I unraveled, the stronger she became. She made me write this letter. She said, "You need to know her story. That with every person who learns about her, she grows stronger, more real. Maybe she's done toying with me. Why else would she make me write how it ends? A swift slash of her wrist, a crimson pool surrounding her, just like her mother's. I know what's going to happen to me tonight. If you're listening this, it's probably already too late for you too." There was nothing that appeared out of the ordinary about my father's house, other than the fact that it didn't have an address. None of the houses on that street did. The people who lived on that block all had to make do and get their mail from a P.O. box in town. I was surprised to learn that this was rare but not unheard of. Not every road in the United States has a name. There are some roads less traveled, even in the age of Google Maps. My father moved into this house about 10 years ago. It had belonged to his then-wife, and I hadn't heard much from him since, which wasn't out of the ordinary since we didn't speak often. It wasn't scorched earth, but we were never close. My mother died shortly after I was born, so it had always been just the two of us. But he was solitary by nature, and the older I got, the less we had to talk about, until eventually we became two strangers. Nothing in common besides our DNA. I heard of my father's passing through his attorney. It was a call from an unknown number telling me that my father had left me this unmarked house on an unnamed road. Bad news, your father is dead. Good news, you're a homeowner. I had never stepped foot on the property. To be honest, I never imagined myself moving out of the city. But as a family man, you do what you have to do to survive. My wife and I just had a baby girl. We had been looking for a house in our neighborhood, but the prices were bad and the school districts were worse. The timing of this phone call and the news about this house seemed serendipitous, lucky even. A couple of years ago, transplanting our lives and moving to the sticks would have been unthinkable. But things were different now. My job became entirely remote. My wife had taken a career pause after having our daughter. Starting over in a 4-bedroom house on a tree-lined street seemed doable, even if it was in the middle of nowhere. We agreed that we'd drive down and check it out. We took a look at the house and hired an inspector to make sure there wasn't anything suspect about the property. Everything was in fine working condition, and aside from a small leak in the roof, the house was holding up well for its age. It was a handsome craftsman, charming and down to earth. Sure, we could have put it on the market and gotten a condo in the city with whatever cash we could have sold it for. But my wife fell in love with the place upon arrival. Something about the house and the street felt timeless, like something you'd see on a postcard. And that was that. Within a matter of days, we left our apartment and uprooted our lives to move into our new home. I didn't have a lot of friends back in the city. Everyone moved across the country in the first years of the pandemic. Catherine and Zoe, my wife and daughter, were my whole world, or at least most of my world. The rest of it was on the internet, so the transition wasn't as bad as I feared. As we were moving in, one of our neighbors stopped by to introduce himself. His name was Malcolm. He was a warm and old-fashioned man. His wife, Barbara, came by minutes later with a casserole. They looked like they walked out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Friendly neighbors, I thought to myself, like you see in the movies. In the city, we had lived in the same building for almost 10 years and knew nobody else in it, besides the person who lived above us, who I only spoke to with open hostility. Now at least we knew two friendly faces. Malcolm asked about my father, and if he told me anything about this house or this neighborhood, to which I said, zilch. Malcolm smiled. Well, one of the quirks of not having an address is that people from town can never seem to find it. Repairmen, deliverymen, you name it. Malcolm added that he used to work as a handyman, and he offered his services if anything ever needed attention. A casserole and a friendly repairman, not bad for day one. Catherine and I were still unpacking, so the meeting was warm but brief. On their way out, Malcolm turned to me and asked another question. His tone of voice shifted this time. Have you seen anyone unexpected walking by? Unexpected? I'm not sure what you mean. Malcolm paused for a moment. This street is a special place. We get a lot of folks passing through, he said before digging one of his business cards out of his wallet. Call me once you see your first passerby. And with that, they were gone. Everything else about Malcolm was so straightforward and no nonsense that this comment really stuck out to me. His countenance became so strange. What the hell was he talking about? I asked Catherine what she thought he meant, and she believed it was crystal clear. Unexpected passerbys? He probably saw a person of color and freaked out, or someone homeless. That's what we get for moving to the country. The bigger the houses, the smaller the minds. I couldn't help but smile. Catherine was such a spitfire. I usually kept things bottled in, and Catherine was a fire hose. I reminded her that she was the one that fell in love with this place, and we probably shouldn't assume our neighbors are bigots on day one. Before she could convince me that I was wrong, Zoe woke up crying and the conversation slipped away. We ate their casserole that night. It was incredible. I thought about Malcolm's parting words as I lay in bed that night, holding them in my mind until I finally drifted off to sleep. The first time it happened was about a week later. I was taking out the trash when I saw someone walking by who was, in a word, familiar. He was tall and slender, wearing a long-brimmed hat and some kind of coat. My mind froze. When a computer is asked to do something beyond its processing capability, you'll see that colored spinning pinwheel. You know what I'm talking about, the pinwheel of death. Well, my brain basically did that. It pinwheeled. Who is this person? Where do I know him from? Is he a man from my past? Is he a celebrity? Someone from my dreams or nightmares? After what felt like forever, it finally clicked. "Mr. Williams," I said with a shout. It was one of my high school teachers. He turned and recognized me immediately. Christ, this man had aged well. I asked him what he was doing here, and he said he was visiting someone down the way. As soon as my brain figured out who he was, I was flooded with 100 feelings and memories. The effect was immediate and sensory. I couldn't explain it. It felt like taking a shot of alcohol at 8 o'clock in the morning. Wowza. Mr. Williams was a strange and singular man. He wasn't the most popular teacher. There were all sorts of rumors about his personal life, but I loved him. He was the first teacher that made numbers seem approachable and even fun. And as someone who now writes computer code for a living, I don't know if I would be where I am if it wasn't for him. I should have told him this, the effect he had on me. But I was so surprised by the encounter and the headspace that it put me in that he was gone before I had the chance to collect myself. I went in to tell Catherine. You'll never believe who I just saw. Catherine and I went to the same high school, but were in totally separate friend groups. I didn't know her in school at all, and we only really got to know each other at our 5-year reunion. But she would know exactly who Mr. Williams was, and how random it was to see him crossing our street. After I finished telling her the story, she looked confused. I could have sworn he died. It was in the newsletter. No, that was the old physics teacher. Mr. Williams is alive, and let me tell you, that man has not aged a day. Maybe he's a vegan. Catherine shrugged, saying what a small world it was, and that was that. Later that evening, after Zoe was down, I went on my computer to try and find Mr. Williams on Facebook. I should have told him how much his classes inspired me. I should have told him back then. I should have told him earlier today. But at the very least, I could add him and drop him a message. After a minute, I found his profile, and my brain became the spinning pinwheel once again. I knew what I was seeing, but it was beyond my processing capability. 6 years prior, Mr. Williams had a seizure while driving and drove off an overpass. When you're living with a newborn, life becomes a blur. With the recent move and the lack of sleep, I quickly realized that I had experienced a waking dream. One time in college, I was so sleep-deprived that I saw someone who wasn't there. Surely that's what this was. That's what this had to be. I put the encounter out of my mind and refused to think of it anymore. A couple of days later, I was doing laundry when I found a soaked and waterlogged business card in the washer. It was from Malcolm. His parting words once again came into focus. Call me once you see your first passerby. Based on the cut of his hair and the size of his truck, I had believed Catherine's take on this comment, that this was an old man grumbling about neighbors that made him uncomfortable. But I had seen someone who couldn't have been there. Perhaps he had seen someone as well. The card was wet and pulpy, but his number was still legible. My hands were shaking as I dialed him. He picked up quickly, and after introducing myself, got straight to the point. Who'd you see? I stepped into the backyard, out of Catherine's earshot. I told him everything. My encounter with Mr. Williams, a man who had long been dead, how I spoke to him and how he looked exactly like he did 20 years ago. I felt a low-grade panic saying this all out loud. This was fucking insane. As I rambled on, the spinning pinwheel of my brain hummed at a fever pitch. When Malcolm got the sense that I was done, he spoke plainly. calmly even. He told me to sit down, so I did. He took a deep breath and told me to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I apologize that I didn't warn you what you were in for here, but if I did, you wouldn't have listened to me anyway. I needed you to see for yourself. This is a very, very special place. He took another breath. Between words, I could hear my own heart pounding. You can see people from the past here. Nobody knows why, but sure as the day follows the night for some reason, people from your past stroll down the street like they're just going about their lives. It ain't always dead people, although those are the ones that will really cook your goose. You still hearing me, son? All I could manage was a grunt. Good. Now my wife and I have lived here a long time. We've come to love it, as I'm sure you will too. But just to save you some trouble, I wanted to let you know a few things we've learned to make the transition easier. Are you still in a place where you can hear these things? I grunted again. Okay, well, first off these people never come inside. They insist they have somewhere to go, and if you get too pushy, they just leave. We learned that the hard way. Likewise, you can't seem to follow them for long. You can tail them for a block or two, but within the blink of an eye, poof, they up and vanish. That took us a long time to accept. Being as old as we are, there are some people you don't want to let go of. Trying to chase them is more pain than it's worth. Do you understand what I'm saying? He paused for a moment, as if that part was more important than the rest. Yeah. The other thing is that when you see these people, they're not omnipotent. It's not like they're in heaven or something, you know? Your high school teacher wasn't talking to the you from today. He was talking to the you from high school, you understand? I did. Perhaps that's why my conversation with Mr. Williams was so curt. Malcolm went on. The interesting thing here is that it can really be anyone. You have no say in it. As long as it's someone you have memories of, you really might see him strolling down the street. I'm sure you're still taking this in, but I promise you, once you get used to it, it becomes just a little quirk. Now, I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. There's no way in the world you know what I'm thinking. He laughed. You're thinking, am I going to tell my wife or wait for her to see for herself? I paused. That wasn't what I was thinking, but it's sure as shit what I was thinking about now. Malcolm told me to call him whenever. He kept repeating the word special, so I ended the conversation as quickly as I could. I felt insane. I could hear my baby crying in the house and Catherine doing her best to comfort her. But I wasn't ready to go inside yet. My head was still spinning. I needed to take a walk. I hadn't smoked in several years, but after that phone call, I walked down to the corner store and had a cigarette. As I took a drag on an American Spirit, I decided I wasn't going to tell Catherine because I didn't think any of this was real. I had no idea what was happening, but it sure as hell wasn't this window to the past bullshit that Malcolm described. I am a coder and computer programmer, and while I know that there's more to life than ones and zeros, there's a certain straightforwardness to computer binary that I've always found comforting. Things either are or aren't. People are dead or alive. They're with you or they're gone. I don't see any in between there. I remember reading a story online about this guy who started seeing all sorts of crazy shit in his apartment. Sticky notes that had been left in the night by mystery intruders. Fire ants appearing and disappearing in impossible places. He lived in a windowless apartment with concrete walls, so he didn't know how any person or insect could be sneaking in. He started asking for help on an online forum about what rights he had to break his lease and what not. After a stream of crackpot theories and suggestions, someone on the forum suggested he get his carbon monoxide detector checked, since he was in a windowless room. Sure enough, the detector was busted, and this guy had been inhaling so much carbon monoxide that he started tripping balls. It was a miracle he didn't die. It was all in his head. But I thought of that story as I stomped out my cigarette. There's an answer. There's always an answer. I spent the next 2 weeks hiring every inspector and public health agency I could to come check out the street. Surely it couldn't be carbon monoxide if it was all happening outdoors, but there had to be a natural gas leak or something in the water supply. Like Malcolm mentioned, it was hell to get anyone to come out to the place, with the lack of addresses and all, but eventually they made their way. And one by one, they gave the house, the yard, and the street a clean bill of health. I heard footsteps behind me, the slap of Catherine's favorite flip-flops, and saw that she had come outside. She heard some of the commotion and asked what was going on. I made up some lie about wanting to make sure everything was safe for Zoe, which was half true because at this point, I was convinced there was some massive gas leak going on here. It had to be something like that. Catherine looked confused but was too tired to question it any further. As the last of the inspectors was packing up, I saw a 10-year-old boy on the other side of the street. One glance confirmed who he was. I froze in my tracks. His name was Caleb, my closest friend from ages 0 to 12, the kind of friend you have when you're that age and never again. But there he was, wearing this dorky orange street shark swimsuit he always wore to the public pool when we were kids. I could barely stand to look at him. Like when I saw Mr. Williams, there was this immediate sensory feeling, which felt even stronger this time. It was overwhelming. I didn't realize it during my first encounter, but when these people show up, you don't just see them, you feel them. And seeing this boy looking like he did was like walking into a candle store that smelled like your childhood bedroom. The rush was immediate. My head started spinning again. What the fuck was happening? As I tried to keep my bearings, I saw a different neighbor in her yard, tending to her garden. We made eye contact and she extended a friendly wave. I was in no mood for small talk, so I cut right to it. I asked her if she saw these passerbys as well. "Oh yes," she said, as casually as if I had asked her about the weather. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Fuck, I had seen it, and felt it twice now. And if it wasn't some collective hallucination, then this was more real than I cared to admit. As soon as I got inside, Catherine could tell something was wrong. So I spilled the beans. I told her everything. How she was right about Mr. Williams, and how I called Malcolm and what he told me. I told her the truth about the inspections, and that the other neighbors I talked to said that they could see it too. I talked until I could talk no more, and then I just looked at her, desperate for her to say something. Anything. After a moment, she started nodding her head, and to my great surprise said that she had seen people as well. She said she could have sworn she saw a childhood dog out of the corner of her eye when we toured the home. And a few days ago, she saw a woman that looked exactly like a beloved childhood nanny. While my encounters brought me panic, Catherine's brought her comfort. One thing that's important to know about Catherine is that, if I'm about ones and zeros, Cat is all about ambiguity and mystery. She believed in the secret language of the universe, that people from beyond would speak to us, that signs would present themselves. So her baseline was already a little out there. Being the skeptic that I was, this is the sort of thing her and I would spar about when we were dating. But we made it work somehow. You know what they say about opposites. It sounded like her encounters were less direct than mine, which is why she took them as omens. On one sense, I was relieved that she didn't think I was crazy, that I didn't need to spend the day convincing her that I saw what I saw. But after a moment, my relief gave way to insecurity. Why didn't she tell me that she saw people? Catherine frowned. The last time she shared something she believed was a sign, I wasn't exactly comforting. A couple years back, a monarch butterfly landed on her out of the blue, and Catherine, being the woman that she is, was convinced it was this message from her grandmother, who, of course, had a thing for butterflies. In no gentle fashion, I told her that I thought that was ludicrous, and ever since then, she's been less than forthcoming about the things she perceived as messages from the other side. I felt a hot flash of guilt. I couldn't exactly blame her. And it's not like I told her immediately either. Husband of the year over here. The situation being what it was, we discussed our options, whether it was worth it to get the hell out of here, or if it was worth giving it a shot. For our daughter. All we wanted was to do right by Zoe. Neither Catherine nor I had great relationships with our parents, and Catherine moved around as a kid, never having a home base. We wanted everything to be solid for Zoe. It had to be. So despite these passerbys, if everything else was right, maybe this still made sense for us. Everywhere has its quirks, right? We looked each other in the eye and promised that we'd give it a shot. Once we accepted our unique situation, it started to feel normal a lot faster than I would have thought. We had between 1 and 2 encounters a week, and most of the time they were pretty low-key. It would have been exhausting if each encounter was emotionally significant, but luckily most of them were really quite mundane, and the accompanying sensation was mild. You'd be getting groceries out of the car and suddenly you'd see your old coworker crossing the street, or the person who had the locker next to you in high school who you never really talked to, or the person you shared a bunk with in summer camp in the 8th grade, who became your best friend for 7 days, and then vanished from your life completely. If it was someone random that could cross your mind, chances are they'd cross the street. But every once in a while, things would get pretty interesting. Malcolm was right. It didn't seem to matter if people were living or dead. And as I soon learned, It didn't much matter if they were real or fictional either. One morning around Zoe's first birthday, I had enough energy to go for a jog. And when I opened the door, who did I see but a young Harrison Ford, dressed as Indiana Jones, being chased by a dozen Peruvian natives. This was the opening scene from Raiders, of course, a movie I had seen more times than I could count. I guess as long as it was something that was rattling deep inside your head, it was fair game. Since I had already laced up my running shoes, I decided to give Malcolm's theory a test run. He said that if you chase them, eventually they disappear. So I wanted to see how far I could push it. I took off from my porch and joined the Peruvians to chase Harrison. It was exhilarating. I was out of shape, and Harrison Ford in 1981 was not. I followed the natives for a couple blocks, eventually joining them in a full-throated holler. I had just started to gain on that handsome bastard when in the blink of an eye, poof. Harrison and the whole tribe were gone. It was extremely disorienting. By this point, I had accepted that the encounters were real, or at the very least real-ish. But seeing them vanish into thin air like that really freaked me out. I put on my headphones and kept going, a million questions running through my brain. Catherine said she saw the Spice Girls in their double-decker tour bus once. Another time I saw the entire cast of a forgotten sitcom just hanging out in my neighbor's yard. But most of the time it was people we knew. Sometimes the passerbys would echo a particular moment in your life, which always made for a good story. Like when I saw my friend Caleb wearing what he did on our lazy summer days. Since Catherine and I went to the same high school, we had a very similar pool of people in our shared past. This always made for excellent conversation. At dinners, we'd talk about the people we saw that week, what they were wearing, where in the world we were when we saw them last. In any long-term relationship, you eventually run out of things to talk about. But with these passerbys, I was learning so much about Catherine every week. Hearing about her childhood friends, her dreams, the past versions of herself that she no longer was. And I was sharing more about myself too. Every week was like a different prompt. I soon realized that I was really coming around to this place. On my best days, I truly considered it a gift. But not every passerby was a barrel of laughs. One day I came home from some errands, and I found Catherine on the couch, immobile. I could tell she had been crying. She told me it was nothing, but she could barely function for the rest of the day. That night I put it together and asked her who she saw, and she told me she'd tell me later. But I knew she wouldn't, and I knew not to ask again. Not all memories are friendly ghosts. Despite my best intentions, there were encounters I didn't tell Catherine about. I saw every ex-girlfriend I ever had, every flirtation, fixation, and infatuation, everyone I dated or tried to date. I saw these women as I knew them, which meant that they didn't look like they do now on Instagram, with their children and houses and dogs. They looked like they did in college and even high school. They were young and beautiful. Seeing them made me uncomfortable. One Saturday, I saw my college girlfriend Monica roll up in her blue Mitsubishi Eclipse. When Monica and I were dating, we had good seasons and bad seasons, but apparently this memory was during one of the better ones. She rolled down her window and told me to get in the car, like we had somewhere to be. I didn't get in, but I talked to her for the better part of 20 minutes. It was nice, honestly. All we did was talk, but I felt like a traitor walking back into my house. There were other women, too. Beautiful strangers I had fallen in love with and never saw again. But the most striking run-in I had with a woman from my past was with my wife. I was confused because I thought Catherine was inside with Zoe. But I realized, this is an encounter. There she was in front of me. I was seeing the Catherine I remembered from when we started dating. Physically, there wasn't much of a difference, but the longer I looked at her, the more I could see it. Her hair was a bit longer, and there was somehow more vibrance, more energy. This was still a Catherine with an air of mystery. This was still a Catherine before we had kids. Jesus, we were the kids back then. You know how you don't think someone like Tom Cruise or Barack Obama has aged until you see a picture of them 10 years ago? Or you think that your living room carpet hasn't faded until you see a patch that was hidden under the couch. Seeing Catherine 8 years ago was kind of like that. I went in to tell her this, excited by this observation. Needless to say, it did not go over well. I thought it was just a statement about entropy, but all she could hear was how old she must look. The more I tried to explain, the worse it got. I shouldn't have compared her to the carpet. Things eventually calmed down by the end of the night. I apologized for my lack of tact, and she eventually let it go. What is marriage? If not a commitment to see the other person get older, she asked. Indeed. That was the plan anyway. That was the plan. Catherine's heart stopped beating at 7:53 on Christmas Eve that year. I wonder if we lived in a house with an address, if the ambulance would have been able to get there faster. I wonder if all the smoking we did in our 20s made her more likely to have an aortic aneurysm. I wonder how I would have spent those days if I knew they were our last. These are things I will wonder and never know. I have come to learn that time eventually flattens all memories, until all you're left with is a few snapshots of any given season. The speedball of adrenaline and animal fear flattened most of my memories of that December. But what I remember of that week, in perfect detail, is this. I remember the Christmas song that was playing in the hospital when the doctors told me she was dead. I remember returning her presents a few days later, telling the cashiers that I had gotten the wrong size and that store credit wasn't necessary. I remember telling Zoe in the daylight, using all of the tips that the internet recommended, seeing her not understand it and having to tell her over and over again. And I remember not crying at Catherine's funeral. You see, running into Catherine at my 5-year reunion was the first miracle of my life, but the second miracle of my life was moving to a street where I would run into her again. This wasn't goodbye. I knew she would find me. It was only a matter of time. I'll check back in shortly. There are very few hard and fast rules at play in this universe. Certainly fewer than we would like to believe. Sure, we have built ourselves a comfortable little modern society, under the false pretense that we are ever truly in control of any of it, overly confident in the knowledge that nothing which exists outside of our realms of understanding can ever harm us. I've had an experience which suggests otherwise recently, one that I will recount to you. A lot of it I'm still processing, still mentally working through. As such, I will not come at this retelling all at once, but rather one step at a time. I feel it important, not only for my own mental well-being, but for your own awareness, that I ensure no detail is missed. I know it sounds cliché, but there really is something of a lesson in all of this. At least, I think there is. This began a little over a week ago, on a hot summer's night in Sydney City. Late was the hour as I finally shuffled my way out of the office, capping off yet another entirely monotonous work week. This was not unusual, of course. A corporate career in Sydney's CBD may seem like a dream for some, and it probably is for the overlords on the top floors, but the reality for most of us shit-kickers is long hours that our pay packets rarely match. Tonight, I had been lucky enough to only give up 2 hours and 15 minutes of my own time. I had long since learned to consider this the norm and not complain, so without another thought to it, I made my way out to the elevator and hit the call button. A resounding ding signaled its arrival to the 7th floor, and I stepped on in before swiftly pressing the button for ground. I wanted out of this dreary old building. It had been a long week, and I was keen to head on over to the Helm Bar for a few cold ones before making my way home for the night. Once again, another ding from the elevator's digital display, and I stepped on out. I gave a quick nod of acknowledgement to Barry, the night guard, before scanning my keycard and opening the door to a blast of hot, humid air. And so concluded the last day of normality I would ever know. As planned, I strolled on over to the Helm Bar, one of my favorite haunts, and always a good spot for happy hour. I ordered myself a drink, grabbed a booth, and I just sat back and looked out over the harbor. The water is beautifully calm this time of night, with not a great number of vessels still operating. Sipping my beer, I raised an eyebrow as I noted something strange. A fog that was certainly not usual this time of year, and yet there it was. A clearly defined fog settling in over Darling Harbor. I continued to watch it over the next hour or so I was there as it steadily grew denser, continuing to expand up and down the surface of the water. At this point, though, I would have been prepared to put it down to the effect of the one too many schooners I had been knocking back. The barkeep's cry of last call finally got me thinking it may be time to make a move and get back home. I gave a wave across the bar signaling my departure, before heading downstairs and making my way back up to the docks to catch the ferry back home. I decided to walk along the water this time. The steady breeze across the harbor was a nice break from the insufferable heat. As I strolled, I couldn't help but notice that fog again. It had grown thicker still, and I wondered if the ferries would even still be running with this lack of visibility. I stepped up my pace a bit, breaking into a jog and running down the ramp at the Barangaroo docks. I didn't want to miss out on potentially the last ride home. Thankfully, there it was, just pulling in as I made my way down the ramp, swiping my card at the gates. I waited for the departing passengers to make their way off, before stepping on board and taking a seat inside. Looking out the portside window, I watched as the crew pulled back the ramp and latched the gates, before the ferry pulled away from the dock and made its way out onto the harbor. As it did so, I realized I had majorly goofed. This ferry was going the opposite way, damn it, I thought. I'd either have to sit on board for the long trip up and down the Parramatta River or get off at the next stop and change. I chose the latter. It would be hours before I got home otherwise. In hindsight, that would have been preferable. I got up from my seat, making my way out to the open air, glancing out across the dark waters as the lights of the ferry cut through the thick, foggy night air. We could barely see 10 meters or so ahead, and I honestly wondered how safe this actually was. The thought of crashing head-on into another ship in the middle of the harbor was a harrowing thought, and as I gazed down into the black, foggy depths, I shuddered just to think of it. That had always been a fear of mine, the idea of deep water. I was fine on boats, strangely enough, but when it comes to actually swimming in water like that, that's a whole other story. Not even touching on the bull sharks. Just the fact that you're floating above what is essentially a giant hole in the ground, if not for the liquid keeping you suspended above it. Thalassophobia, they call it, and I had been cursed with it from a young age. I still recall the first time I watched Jaws. That scene with the girl's legs dangling haplessly in the water gave me nightmares for weeks on end. I breathed a sigh of relief as 2 blasts from the ferry's horn rang out through the night, and we began to dock at Balmain East. With a loud clang, the ramp was wheeled out, and I quickly made my way off the boat. What a monumental screw-up this had been. I would be waiting at least another half hour for the return trip, and I still had to change services before I would be on my way home. It would be long past midnight before I finally made it back. On the bright side, it was a weekend, so I could at least have a sleep in tomorrow. I took a seat on a small wooden bench that looked like it probably should have been replaced years ago and waited for the next ferry to come along. I sighed, checking my watch and noticing the time was ticking closer and closer to midnight. I paused for a moment. I actually wasn't sure if the ferries even ran after midnight. I glanced up and down the harbor, getting a little worried now, but I couldn't see anything. Just fog. I turned my head and listened carefully for any signs of an approaching vessel, but no luck. All I could hear was the soft lapping of the water against the docks. I sat there for a little while longer, feeling more and more uneasy as yet more time ticked by with not a single indication that any return ferry was coming my way. I stood up, ready to try my luck with Uber or a cab. I pulled out my phone, noting the clock reading 11:58 p.m., and prepared to open the Uber app, when what do you know? Along came my ferry. Thank goodness, I thought to myself, that would have been a very expensive ride home, especially at this hour. Scanning my card for the second time that night, I climbed on board and once again grabbed a seat inside the air-conditioned cabin. I rested my head against the glass window and watched outside, taking in the sights of the distant city lights beyond the foggy harbor. I could have dozed off right there and then, to be honest, and I may have, were it not for the almighty bang that startled me out of my relaxed state. The ferry gates had been absolutely slammed shut with a force well beyond necessary. This guy must be having a bad day, I thought, and I made a mental note to stay clear of him. I sat back again and continued to gaze out the window as the ferry's engine powered up and we were out on the open water again, this time in the right direction. 2 resounding blasts from the ferry's horn woke me from an unintentional nap. Damn it, had I missed my stop? Wiping my bleary eyes, I stretched and took a look around. The first thing I noticed was the fog. It was beginning to clear a little, but it was still hard to see outside. The second thing I noticed was a fellow passenger. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I'm sure I would have heard if we had stopped. I took a glance out of my peripheral. I'm sure this guy was not here before. I suppose he could have come down from upstairs or something, but that wasn't the weirdest part. No, what was weird was his seemingly undivided attention squarely on me. There was no mistaking it. He was staring intently right at me. I tried to ignore him to look out the window, but even then I could see clearly his wide eyes in the reflection. He was giving me the creeps. I decided to get up and get some fresh air. Primarily, I just wanted to get away from him to avoid a confrontation with what looked to be a person strung out on some kind of substance. That wasn't entirely uncommon in the city at late hours. I quietly slid out of my row of seats and made a beeline for the rear doors, sliding them open and stepping out on deck into the fresh air. It took me a minute to comprehend what I was feeling, as it was so far outside the realms of normal. The air was freezing cold. Bear in mind, this is smack in the middle of an Australian summer, just moments before the air had been miserably hot. Boom! Boom! Another 2 blasts from the ferry's horn rang out in the now bitter cold night. The ferry jerked a little from side to side, so I grabbed hold of the railing as I walked around to the front of the vessel. The lights carved a path through the fog, and I could see we were pulling into Milson's Point. Glancing down at my watch now, I froze in disbelief. It was now 2 a.m. in the morning. That was not possible. For one thing, this stop should be a 5-minute ride at most from Balmain East. And secondly, this ferry route definitely did not run this late. In fact, when I really thought about it, I was surprised there was even a ferry coming back this way in the first place. I couldn't recall, as I was not usually out that late, but I didn't think they ran past midnight, not as far as I knew. As for one running back and forth across the harbor at 2 a.m., no way. Never has been. Likely never will be. Crash! I jolted back as the ferry came to an abrupt stop. Oh my God, we had hit something, I knew it. My anxiety kicked into full gear as I glanced around for the nearest life jacket. Merely seconds later, however, an announcement came over the PA system. Please relax, we are simply adjusting our heading. Return to your seats, please. I slowly made my way back inside, my heart still racing. I decided to take a seat up front this time so I could keep an eye on what was going on. I caught sight of that weirdo on the way past, and there was no mistake. He was staring right into my damn soul. What frightened me, though, was not just the fact that he was staring, but the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was concern. He genuinely looked like he was troubled to see me there. He finally looked away as I passed him by and shot him a stare right back, letting him know that he had long since crossed my boundaries. He didn't look annoyed or offended in any way, though. He just looked down at his feet sheepishly. Honestly, that gave me more of a chill than if he had gotten out of his seat and started throwing fists. I continued on up to the front of the ferry and took a seat right next to the window facing out over the bow. There I sat and waited and watched. Onwards we sailed, past the Sydney Harbour Bridge, past the Opera House, and I almost breathed a sigh of relief as we made the turn headed back out to my final stop. But here's the thing, we didn't stop. Instead of continuing on around the bend to Manly Beach, the ferry made a hard right, sailing out beyond the boundaries of the harbor, sailing out into open waters. The fog began to thicken once again, and the frosty air of the night started to seep its way inside the cabin. The ferry was rocking back and forth more violently now as we disappeared into the open ocean, away from the safety of the harbor lights, away from the calm waters within it. My stomach dropped as I felt the boat lift up and over one of the many looming dark waves outside before coming crashing down again. It was, of course, at this point I knew something was very wrong. Lifting my watch up again, I noted the time, 3 a.m. Another hour had passed since we had drifted away from Milson's Point. My head began to spin as I wondered as to the possibilities. Had this ferry been hijacked? I ran up the stairs and I bashed on the captain's door. I screamed and shouted, trying to get someone's attention, but no response came. There was nothing more I could do. Defeated, I staggered my way to the back of the vessel, my legs like jelly now, and I collapsed to the floor. I just stared outside. My line of sight from here a straight shot out through the upper rear doors. Darkness. That was all I could see. There was not even any sign of the vibrant city lights anymore. We were far beyond where any city ferry should be sailing. We were slowly disappearing further and further into the darkness of the South Pacific. So there I laid and there I watched as the hours slowly ticked by. Eventually, my eyes could remain suspended no longer, and sleep finally took me. It was a rather slow realization as I awoke to a new day. The crushing truth that none of this had been a dream slowly dawning on me as I awoke to the sound of waves lashing against the upper floor windows. It was then that my sleepy state rapidly subsided, and I recalled every awful detail of the previous night. With the effects of last night's alcohol consumption largely wearing off by this stage, little things began to come back to me. The first notable image which ran through my mind with renewed clarity was the arrival of this mysterious ferry at Balmain East near on midnight. It was clear to me now there were definitely not supposed to be any ferries running back this way at that time. And furthermore, something about the vessel didn't look right. The ferries of Sydney Harbour have a distinct green and yellow look to them, I suppose I passed it off at the time, as it was dark and foggy, and I was more interested in getting home than anything. But I did recall being slightly taken aback at the time by the unique dark gray coloring of this one. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, intending to head outside and confirm my hazy memory, when I heard a crackle from above me. "Greetings, passengers. The cafe service is now open. Please proceed to the counter in an orderly fashion, and you will be served momentarily." Huh, I thought. I might actually get to speak to someone, maybe find out what the hell is going on. I glanced around, and yes, there was indeed a man behind the counter at the cafe. He was a rather tall individual, bald, and he wore a gray suit. Strange attire for a cafe worker on a commuter ferry, I thought. But then again, look where we are. I gathered myself before standing up and making my way over to the cafe. There were a couple of passengers ahead of me, so I stood back and waited my turn. Their behavior seemed ever so slightly off to me, and I was reminded of the strange man last night. They were acting very similar to him, standing there nervously, shifting their weight from side to side, heads down staring at their feet. The first man made his way up to the counter and quietly mumbled something to the attendant before stepping back and waiting for his order. The tall man behind the counter smiled softly before turning around and reaching into the freezer compartment, pulling out a Mrs. Mac sausage roll and throwing it into the microwave. He then returned to the counter as the second customer stepped up, placing an order for a coffee and a slice of carrot cake. Cafe guy gave me a weird vibe. He was simultaneously the kindest man I had ever laid eyes on, smiling the sweetest of smiles as he served the customers their orders, and yet there was something ominous about his demeanor, as though secrets were hiding behind those kind eyes, secrets I wanted in on. I snapped myself back into the present moment as I noticed he was staring at me, and I stepped up to the counter. His expression changed as he got a good look at me, the kind smile replaced with a look of concern and a hint of amusement. He mused. Interesting. I raised an eyebrow at this, curious to know what he found so interesting about me. Excuse me, but what's interesting? I asked him, not bothering to beat around the bush. He stared back at me for a moment before shaking his head. "Oh, sorry, sir, never mind me. It's a bit too early in the morning, I suppose. What can I get you today?" I glanced around behind me, and seeing no more customers waiting in line, I decided now was a good time to press for answers. I leaned in, lowering my voice to an almost whisper. "Can you tell me what's going on? I got on this ferry late last night, and before I knew what was going on, we were heading out to sea. Is this normal? Is there a new route I don't know about? And what's with the captain?" He didn't answer when I knocked on the door and called out. Cafe guy breathed in slowly before letting out a sigh, and I stepped back, sensing a little annoyance on his part. I quickly relaxed, though, as that kind smile returned. "Sir, this is the same route this service has always taken. This is the same route it will always take. There's no need to worry, you'll be home soon. Now what can I get you?" I just stared at him, a mix of curiosity and concern present on my face, but I decided to place a molecule of faith in his words. He seemed confident that I'd be on my way back home soon enough. Don't get me wrong, even in that moment I was still acutely aware that something was very wrong with this ferry, but it's amazing how far the rational side of the brain can stretch when it wants to. With a sigh, I spoke up. "Just a coffee, thanks, mate. Latte. 2 shots. Cafe guy nodded. "Coming right up, sir?" I waited patiently as he prepared my coffee, humming Kumbaya to himself as he did so. He was an odd fellow with a personality that didn't seem to match his face. With a hiss of the coffee machine, steam pouring out of the vents, my coffee was ready, and he handed it to me with that same warm smile, never wavering. I nodded to him before turning and walking back toward the rear doors, eager to get some caffeine into my system. Sliding open the rear doors, I stepped out onto the upper deck, walking over to the railings and resting against them as I stared out over the infinite blue expanse before me. Yep, definitely wasn't a dream. There was no sign of land in any direction. I noticed how strangely quiet it was, and I then realized the ferry's engine wasn't running. We were just kind of bobbing up and down there in the water. The waves, a little calmer now, lapping up against the side of the boat. I gripped the railing a little tighter, as I noted the absence of seagull calls, realizing we must be very, very far out to sea. I felt a chill come over me as I imagined the expansive black hole beneath the ferry, the only protection from being swallowed up by it being this rickety bucket of bolts I was standing on. My grip on the railing tightened a little further as the ship subtly rocked from side to side. I sipped my coffee, trying my best to distract myself from those thoughts, and I pondered what lay ahead for me. My mind was still plagued by the possibilities as to what could be going on, still not satisfied that a hijacking was out of the question. Would we soon be approached by pirate vessels? Would we simply explode at any moment, leaving any survivors to the fate of the Pacific Ocean? No, that didn't make sense. There weren't enough of us on board to make any kind of terroristic political statement worthwhile. There was something more to this. I didn't know what, but with every passing second, the hope of actually getting home was becoming more and more of a distant pipe dream. Boom! Boom! Two loud blasts from the ferry's blower and the engine roared to life, an announcement over the PA following a moment later. Attention passengers, this service will be departing momentarily. The cafe is now closed. Please take your seats. I stepped back inside just in time to see cafe guy closing up shop and heading downstairs. He gave me a little wave as he left, and I hesitantly gave a half-hearted wave back to him. I really wasn't sure about this guy, and I think he knew it. Something about his non-answers earlier had my alarm bells ringing. Chugging back the last of my coffee, I threw the cup in the trash before heading downstairs to grab a seat on the front deck. I noticed my fellow passengers on the way past, all three of them this time, all sitting in the same row of seats. They gave me a little side-eye as I walked past, one of them still chowing down on his sausage roll as he stared at me, a look of apprehension in his eyes. What the hell? Why were they so worried about my presence? Brushing it off, I pushed open the door to the deck and made my way up to the bow, grabbing a seat in the shade provided by the upper deck. There I sat, my leg nervously bouncing up and down as the ferry began to make a move. I wondered where we were headed this time. Norfolk Island? Auckland? Bloody Antarctica? All I could see ahead of me and out both sides was blue. It gave me the feeling of being stranded in another world. In a lot of ways, I suppose I was. The underwater realm beneath me a dark, endless, alien landscape to those of us who dwell above it. I shook my head, not wanting to think about that. The ferry began to pick up speed now, and the winds blew harshly across my face. It was still cold, despite being in the middle of the summer months. I squinted my eyes and shuffled across a couple of rows where I could be at least a little shielded from the harsh sea breeze, and there I kicked back and tried my best to enjoy the ride. For ages we sailed. It must have been at least 3 hours at a guess before I finally began to catch sight of land. It wasn't long before the iconic Sydney skyline started to come back into view, and I felt at least some relief in the knowledge that we were heading in the direction of some form of normality. The vessel slowed its pace as it rounded the bend into Port Jackson, and we began the scenic cruise into Sydney Harbor. Despite the strangeness, I couldn't help but take in the beauty around me. I had lived here for many years and I had seen these sights a million times, but they still never failed to take my breath away. My home city truly is beautiful. Picture-perfect beaches and stretches of crystal blue waters define the natural landscapes, intertwined with lush forest reserves, age-old architecture, and the awe-inspiring cityscape rising up beyond. The smell of the salty harbor air gave me something of a sense of calm as we sailed past beautiful Watson's Bay, the Sydney Harbor National Park, Robertson's Point, the Botanical Gardens, and eventually rounding the bend into Circular Quay as the Harbor Bridge and Opera House came into view. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen it, there's still that same sense of wonder that overcomes you every time you lay eyes on it. I actually managed to crack a smile in that moment, my racing, anxious mind finally slowing to a manageable pace. We were back. I was almost home. Except, I wasn't. It probably took me longer than I should have, but eventually it dawned on me. Where the hell was everyone? I got up from my seat and I walked around to the port side of the ferry, looking out over Circular Quay, usually packed with tourists and people going about their day by this hour. Yet it was eerily empty. I could see random people, just figures, walking between various laneways and side streets in the distance, but nobody walking along the waterfront. The restaurants, normally so busy the lines are out the doors, were all closed. Even the Opera House was strangely deserted. No tourists posing for photos, no tour groups making their rounds. I wondered if perhaps it was a public holiday or something. But no, I didn't think it was. At least not as far as I knew. That shouldn't account for the total lack of tourists in any case. I continued to pace around the deck, my feet clanging against the metal as I strolled. and I gazed out all over the harbor. There were a few vessels out and about, but even the water traffic was very quiet today. Nowhere near as many boats out as there usually were. The ferry began to slow its pace now, the engine dying down to a low gurgle as we began to swing into Darling Harbor. I glanced out over the oddly still waters as we steadily drifted by the Barangaroo docks, where all this had begun. I was silently hoping perhaps we may be stopping there, but alas, it was not to be. The ferry did indeed stop, however, right there in the middle of the harbor. The vessel lurched backwards, swinging to the left slightly as it came to an abrupt halt, and I steadied myself on a nearby pole as it did. I shot glances all around, wondering what may be the cause of this sudden emergency stop. As I stood there, I began to get the strangest sensation come over me. It was nothing like the creeping dread that had been building over the last 12 hours. It was a sudden, urgent sensation, screaming at me that I was not safe. I stood frozen, clinging to that pole and staring out over the deck, into the deep, murky waters mere feet away. Suddenly, startling me out of my fixation, an announcement over the crackly PA system. Remain inside the vessel. Attention. Remain inside the vessel. For your own safety, do not go near the water. I repeat, stay away from the water. I leaned back a little upon hearing that. This has got to be a joke, right? An audible ripple on the surface startled me, and I took a step back. The water was otherwise still. What had caused that? Another barely perceptible splash, and the water began to ever so slightly bubble, right there in that one spot where the ripple had appeared. I slowly stepped back, fearing sudden movements may startle something. One step, then another, until finally I could feel the port side doorway. I quietly slid open the door and stepped backwards inside before sliding it shut again. I turned around and I froze. All three of my fellow passengers were staring at me, eyes wide with fear. Not concern this time, no, stone-cold fear. I didn't know what to do. I just stared back at them, gesturing with my hands as if to say, "What?" They all turned away as I did so, looking straight ahead, their backs rigid, their hands in their laps. I didn't know what was going on, but I got the vibe that the expectation was to sit still and be quiet. So I quickly grabbed a seat next to the doorway and steeled myself. As I sat there in my seat, I heard things. It was barely audible at first, but grew slightly louder with each repetition. A soft banging sound, emanating from below the vessel. Boong! It echoed throughout the cabin. I glanced outside, hoping to catch sight of something. Anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. Boong! There it was again, louder this time. It was as though there was something heavy floating under or around the ship, bashing into it periodically. But here's the troubling part. It was clearly impacting a different area of the ferry each time it happened. Something was down there, intentionally slamming into us. Boom! For many long hours, I and my fellow riders sat there, still as statues, as this, whatever it was, slammed itself into the boat over and over. Occasionally, I could feel us tipping backwards or to the side ever so slightly, and I silently prayed that whatever was doing this did not possess the force necessary to tip this floating nightmare into the harbor where it awaited. I wanted off this ferry, but not that way. The hours ticked on by, and as night began to settle in over Sydney, our knocking menace finally left us be. I couldn't be sure, but I could have sworn as the ferry's engines powered up once again, I saw a clearly defined slipstream catapulting away into the dark waters in front of us. Maybe it was just my imagination, or a trick of the light, but honestly, I don't think so. The ferry began chugging away again, and at this point I was all but convinced I was still not getting off this thing. It had been almost 24 hours by this point. This time last night, I was still slaving away in the office, and as I thought back to that, I'd have given anything to be back there again. I glanced over at my three fellow travelers, still sitting there in that same row of seats, one of them with his head in his hands, shaking his head from side to side. I decided to try my luck and just talk to them. I really wasn't sure how approachable they were, so I'd held off until now. But I wanted answers. I got up from my seat and walked on over to their side of the ship, sitting down one row behind them. I spoke up. "I'm just going to ask, do any of you have any idea what's going on?" They stayed silent, their eyes facing straight ahead, not moving at all. I focused my attention on the one guy who was acting a little differently from the rest, his head still in his hands clearly shaking now. "Mate, please, this is clearly not normal. Whatever is happening here, it's not normal. Please, I just want to know what's happening." The man lifted his head from his hands and slowly turned around to face me. I could see his eyes were red and wet. He was quite a young man, in stark contrast to the older two beside him. He looked like he wanted to say something but was holding back. "Please, man, please, what's going on? Where's this ferry going?" He quietly stared for a moment before speaking up. "To the end of the line." He spoke these words softly, yet with a tone of finality, before turning back around and facing straight ahead like the rest of his group. With a groaning creak, the ferry took a sharp left, adjusting its heading toward the Parramatta River. I sat there in a state of shock. I tried once again to get the attention of any of these guys, but with no luck. Something about the way he said what he did suggested that this end of the line was not a place I wanted to end up. I got up from my seat and left them be, making my way to one of the front rows of seats again, resting my head against the glass and just watching. A strong wind began to pick up outside, and the ferry was swaying softly from side to side, its metal construction straining and creaking as it drifted slowly downriver. As I watched out my window, I noticed things that just didn't make sense. Things were in their place, kind of. I had sailed down this river many times for work functions and whatnot, and everything I was seeing was technically where it was meant to be. But what was there was entirely wrong. A mass of tidal trees, right there where they should be, yet different. Gnarly were their forms, twisted and lanky, not the beautiful green canopy I was used to, but a looming mess of spindly dead limbs which seemed to reach out for our vessel as it slowly made its way past. A few of them even scraped along the side of the ferry as we went, sending out an awful noise not unlike nails on a chalkboard. The houses which lined the river, they were different too. Gone were the beautiful brick-constructed riverfront homes which lined the waters. In their place, tall, cage-like constructions, their bars rattling in the fierce winds outside, and the water from the murky river lashing up and over them. As we sailed closer to them, I began to notice figures inside these cages. People, at least I think they were, flailing around from side to side, splashing through the shallow waters of the riverbanks which these enormous cages sunk into. They waved their hands as the boat sailed by, as if trying to get somebody's attention. I turned away from the window when we sailed close enough by them that I got a good look at their faces. They were terrifying, their expressions distorted into scowls with a burning anger deep in their eyes. I got up from my seat, deciding to once again try to raise someone's attention. I ran up the stairs, making my way to the entrance to the captain's quarters. As I got to the door, I noticed the internal privacy shield was down, and I could see inside this time. I saw only a man facing straight ahead, much like the other passengers. But this man was not nervous. He stood firm, his composure rock solid. I once again tried knocking on the door, screaming at him to open up and help me, but his focus did not break. He had one job, it seemed, to drive this ferry, and nothing was going to stop him. Defeated, I wandered back to the rear of the upper deck, taking a seat by the portside windows. I could do nothing but sit and watch as we traversed further and further into the darkness. As we sailed, I noticed yet another strange figure. Not in the cages this time, no, just walking along the riverside, navigating around those awful trees as it made its way along. Eventually it took a turn, walking down to the riverside. I watched as this person, or this thing, took slow steps out along a strange wooden pier, something that looked like it was built in the 50s. And there they stood. I knew what was coming, but I didn't want to believe it. My heart skipped a beat as the ferry swung a hard left and began pulling into dock at this rickety old jetty. As we pulled in closer, I could see this person's face more clearly. It was a relatively young man, perhaps mid-30s, and he was shaking. Whether from the cold or out of fear, I did not know. I shuddered as a terrible grinding noise rang out as the ferry scraped against the old jetty. A clang from below, and I looked out to see a well-built man wheeling a ramp out onto the wooden docks. It was the same guy from last night, the one I had resolved to keep clear of. But where the hell had he been? I hadn't seen him at all since I boarded. Boom! Boom! Another two blasts from the ferry's horn, followed by a stern voice through the PA. "Do not exit the vessel! Do not exit the vessel! Do not exit the vessel!" My heart was racing. This was my chance. I looked down, watching as the young man shuffled his way across the ramp, the ferry bouncing up and down, threatening to dunk it into the water at any moment. I got up from my seat and started making my way downstairs. "Do not exit the vessel! Do not exit the vessel! Do not exit the vessel!" To hell with that. I picked up my pace, running down the stairs, my only goal to get the hell off this forsaken boat. I gave no thought to the strangeness outside, to this twisted otherworldly plane which awaited me. All I knew was that step one was getting myself off this thing. I broke into a sprint when I hit the bottom floor, dashing toward the doors when suddenly, smack! I ran straight into the boarding passenger. I stepped back, my plight pointless now, as the gate slammed shut and the ferry began to pull away into the night. The man stared at me, his eyes wide and clearly shot with fear. The look in his eyes as he saw me, it was like he was staring his own death in the face. It was haunting. He grabbed onto my arm suddenly and I tried to pull away, asking him what the hell he was doing. He simply stared at me as he gripped me tight and asked, "How? Are you here?" Before I could get a single word out, he turned and ran upstairs. In shock, I just stood there for a moment watching as Ramp Guy slammed the contraption back against the wall and stormed off to the back of the ship. Shaking myself back into the moment, I turned and I ran upstairs following that guy. And I froze. There he stood, right there just beyond the top of the stairs in the aisle, just staring. He didn't look scared anymore, no, he scared me. His face, the best I can describe it, is devoid. Devoid of emotion, devoid of expression, devoid of life. He was completely and totally still, staring straight ahead. Not at me, just straight ahead into thin air. I slowly approached the guy, waving my hand in front of his face. No response. I tapped his shoulder, trying to raise any sign of life. Nothing. Very carefully, I tiptoed around to the side of him, keeping my eyes locked on him at all times. I was just about to back away when in that moment his head snapped toward me. "Are you looking at me?" Jesus Christ. His voice was awful, deep and distorted, and his eyes full of sheer hatred. I stumbled back, almost toppling down the stairs. I grabbed at the rail, trying to keep my composure as I stepped backwards. As I did so, he took measured paces toward me, coming closer and closer. I turned, and I ran. Grabbing the side of the wall, I pivoted around the corner, making a beeline to the ferry's lavatory. I could hear his footsteps, still coming down the stairs as I ripped open the bathroom door and hurled myself inside, locking the door behind me. And there I stayed, listening to this thing. For a human being, I was now convinced it was not, knocking on the door all throughout the night. Knock, 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 3 a.m. Knock, 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 4 a.m. Knock, 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 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. Silence. Finally, silence. I had not slept a wink. All hours of the night I lay there on the cold steel bathroom floor, listening to something knocking on the door. Occasionally I would hear it speak, kind of. What passed for its voice floated through the gap beneath the door. Mostly just gurgles and whispers, but every so often I would make out words. "Too late," it would say in between strange slurping sounds. "Don't let me go," I could make out, on the tail end of a growl, similar to that of a rabid dog. During the night, in between that infernal knocking, I heard the ferry making more stops. I would note different sounds and sensations as the ferry traversed into what felt and sounded like the strangest of places. Some sounded quite similar to the rickety wooden pier we had docked at earlier in the night, but others were different. At times, I would hear what sounded like giant medieval-style drawbridges come crashing down, or the distant clang of an anchor hitting the bottom of the river. River, followed by scratching noises as though things were clawing their way up the sides of the boat, followed by wet footfalls making their way inside the cabin. At around 4 a.m., I felt an immense impact, and I swear I heard the sounds of creaking trees and the ferry itself shaking and vibrating, as though it had sailed straight into the tree line beyond the riverbanks. Of course, I had no visual way to confirm any of this. I could only piece together what I was hearing and feeling. As I'm sure you can appreciate, even when morning broke and I could hear the knocking no longer, I was quite apprehensive to the thought of exiting my safe haven. I may have hidden out there the rest of the day, had it not been for the growls emanating from my own stomach. It dawned on me then, I had not eaten in over 30 hours. It's not that I hadn't noticed, it's that I had quite literally been in a constant state of fight or flight mode pretty much since I boarded. I wouldn't say the fear had worn off by this point, it sure as hell hadn't, but my body was making it very clear it would be ignored no longer. I had to eat. Dong, dong. The sound of buoys outside was music to my ears. Not only did it mean we were back in the harbor, away from that awful river, but I took solace in those subtle reminders of normality. The idea that the world outside this vessel resembled something of what I once knew it to be. I had to hold on to something, anything that might allow the concept of hope to remain strong in my heart. I then heard another familiar sound, the crackle of that damned PA system, and I wondered what horrors the mysterious voice was to command unto me today. "May I have your attention, passengers? The cafe service is now open. Please form an orderly line and you will be served momentarily." Thank God, I thought. I could get some food into my stomach. I slowly inched open the bathroom door, the thought of that awful man who had chased me in there last night ever present in my mind. Thankfully, he was nowhere to be seen as I swung the door open all the way and stepped back out, making my way up and around the corner to the stairwell, and there I paused. I couldn't see that guy anywhere, but there were others now. Some of them I recognized as my fellow passengers from yesterday, or folk similar to them. Others were very different. They were all just shuffling their way up the stairs to the cafeteria, maybe 20 people now altogether, as though this was some sort of ritual that needed to happen, rather than something they wanted to be doing. I gave a little nod as the 3 men I recognized from yesterday limped by me on their way upstairs, but they didn't even look at me. They just stared straight ahead, their jaws slack. They were followed by 2 people. I say people, but I really was not sure. They looked human enough at first glance, but looking closer, I started to notice strange imperfections in their forms, as if they were the result of an AI generator's attempt at a human being. Their legs looked as though they shouldn't be sufficient to support their forms, nor did they move right. They didn't really walk, they stuttered. That's the best I can explain it. Their hands were strange too, long fingers that seemed to curve into pointed ends. I turned my gaze away and shook my head, refusing to focus on them anymore. I had more pressing matters, I thought, as my stomach gurgled once again. I went to the back of the line and started making my way up the stairs, patiently waiting my turn as my traveling companions all collected their orders. Before shuffling off down the stairs, I caught sight of my buddy, cafe guy. He smiled, that same warm smile, going about his routine preparing coffees and heating up frozen pastries and the like, and before long it was my turn. His expression once again changed when he saw me, morphing into more of a sarcastic smile, shaking his head a little. "So, how did the night go?" he asked me, a suggestion in his tone that he knew full well it had not been a good night. I paused a moment, letting out a little sigh and shooting back a defeated look in his direction. "I'm not getting off this ferry, am I?" I asked bluntly. Cafe guy laughed softly as he grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the bench. "It's important to know one's place in this world, I always say. Some questions are above both our pay grades." He answered nonchalantly, but I wasn't letting him off that easily. "Mate, you clearly work here, wherever here is. You obviously know what's going on. What's with the bullshit? If this is all pointless, you may as well tell me what's happening." I snapped back, my patience running thin. He stopped what he was doing, turning around to face me and leaning over the bench before responding. "You say that as though every question has an answer. You ask as if we are entitled to these answers, even were they to exist. Tell me, where were you headed when you boarded this vessel? Do you know? Do any of us know where we're going at any one time, or in the grand scheme of things? I should hope not. There would be no mystery to life if that were the case. Then where would be the excitement? Why do we go to bed with hope in our hearts if not for the fact that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or the next day? I would suggest you keep this in mind, young man." He did not speak these words with any hint of malice or anger. He spoke matter-of-factly, but not as if to suggest impatience on his part. He spoke with the same kindness which emanated from that smile of his. "Boom! Boom!" 2 blasts out of the ferry's horn, and I knew it was time to set sail again. Cafe guy knew it too, giving a couple of taps on the counter as if to hurry me along. "What would you like, sir? I can't hang around here too long." That put me off a little, wondering what his hurry was, but with my hunger drowning out any sense of curiosity, I thought I'd best get my order in. Give me 3 of those sausage rolls you gave that other guy, and maybe 2 of those chicken and mayo sandwiches." I thought I'd best stock up a little. He seemed to only come by in the mornings and not for very long. I then asked him how I might pay for these items, and he simply shook his head. "No payment, sir. Not necessary here," he replied, before continuing to hum that ridiculous tune of his. He handed me the sandwiches and I tucked them under my arm, grabbing the cooked sausage rolls in my left hand as soon as they dinged out of the microwave. He then handed me a coffee and I looked up at him with a questioning look on my face. "You look like you need one," he said, giving me a wink. I laughed and thanked him before heading back downstairs. I noticed the now half-full cabin of people, all sitting on the left-hand side of the ferry, all neatly in rows, either staring straight ahead or munching on their food for the day. I paused a little, taking a couple of steps back as I noticed the man from last night. But he was different now, his face somber, looking down at his feet. I backed away, heading on over to the rear starboard side of the ship and taking a seat against the far wall. I sat my sandwiches down on the seat next to me before ripping into one of the sausage rolls. Oh my God, let me tell you, at that point they tasted like heaven. With my stomach full and satisfied, I decided to head out on deck and get some fresh air. I shot a glance across the ferry, concerned that these people might take this opportunity to rob me of my food reserves. But there they sat, still looking dead ahead or down at their feet. A few of them still shot those weirdly concerned looks in my direction, but looked away as soon as I made eye contact. I took a second to place my sandwiches on the floor and shoved them under a seat against the wall. There, that should do it. I got up, taking a nice swig from my coffee, as I made my way out onto the deck. We were sailing nearby Athol Bay, I noticed, as I made my way around the deck, catching sight of Whiting Beach. I allowed myself a moment to feel relatively okay, delighting in the taste of the fresh coffee, the smell of the salty air, and the beautiful sights and sounds around me. The harbor was alive today. Jet skis and tourist vessels cruised the waters, and the nearby Taronga Zoo was clearly abuzz with people. That had taken a minute to sink in, but it finally clicked. People. In stark contrast to the previous day, where I had only been able to catch glimpses of shadows, remnants of a city once alive and vibrant, today that life had returned, and I realized in that moment I was less than maybe 2 kilometers from a return to this normal world. I threw my coffee on the deck and looked out straight ahead, focusing my attention on Whiting Beach. It was a straight shot, and I was a strong swimmer. I slowly stepped my way to the railings of the vessel and leaned over, looking down into the dark depths of Sydney Harbor. Goosebumps ran up my spine, prickling sharply in my neck as I envisioned how far down the bottom was. I could picture the seafloor in my mind, the coarse sand, the seaweed, the bull sharks with their beady eyes and keen senses waiting for any sign of movement on the surface. No, I couldn't think about that right now. Shark attack statistics tell me I'll most likely be okay. If I stayed on this ferry, there was no such chance. I put one foot up on the railing, gripping the top bar tightly as I swung my leg up and over it, the next one following close behind. My hands remained in a vice grip as I slowly turned around to face the water. The ferry was moving quite slowly, and I could see some little critters swimming around down there as the wind blew softly against my face. It was still freezing, and I wondered if the water would be the same. I wondered if my body would shut down, hypothermia taking me before the sharks even had a chance to. Shaking my head and dispelling these thoughts once again, I accepted the dark waters before me as the lesser of 2 dangers and prepared to dive in, letting go of the railing and leaning forward, when suddenly, "Don't!" I reached back just in time to grab the railing and stop myself from falling. I spun around, darting my eyes in all directions, looking for the source of that voice. And there he was, cafe guy. No smile on his face this time, but a look of sadness and genuine concern for me. "Don't do that," he spoke again before turning and walking back inside, disappearing up the staircase within. I spun back around to face the waters and was met with a crushing reality. They were gone. The vibrant city, which had just a moment ago surrounded me, filling me with hope, was gone. The beaches, the waterside walkways, the harbor itself, devoid of life once again. I lowered my head in defeat, genuinely contemplating hurling myself into the water and being done with it, facing whatever eventuality cafe guy so sternly warned me of. But no, I could not. Wowsoever there was still a chance, I had to hold on. Defeated, I made my way back inside, taking up residence in my row of seats as the ferry began to make its way up and down the harbor again. Onwards we sailed, and as we made our way back down toward Darling Harbor, the ferry started pulling in and making stops in strange ports once more. These were all stops that I recognized, but as the ferry docked in, it became evident that these were very different places from what I knew them to be. With a clunk, we came to a halt at Circular Quay, a stop where usually hundreds of passengers eagerly awaited ferries heading to various destinations. What I saw was little more than a floating platform, more reminiscent of an oil rig than a modern ferry station. I watched as the big guy tossed out the foot ramp and more people shuffled their way onto the ferry. I avoided their gaze as they made their way inside, but I could feel their eyes burning into me as they slowly waddled past, joining the rest of the passengers in their rows of seats. This happened over and over. Every stop we made, what I knew to be reality was simply not there. As we pulled into Milson's Point, the dock now blackened and covered in disgusting barnacles, I reluctantly forced myself to look over toward Luna Park. No more was the colorful, welcoming theme park. In place of the Mr. Moon face, a set of huge barbed wire gates twisting their way up skyward. Where the big top once stood, something that resembled a giant barn, rotting and decayed, more of these human-resembling figures trudging their way out of its massive gates, some of them running toward the ferry and making their way on board. The Ferris wheel? A monstrosity of a contraption, wiry arms sticking out from a dilapidating, screeching metal center grinding around in circles, people clinging onto the ends of these arms going round and round, screaming as they did so. I looked away, wanting to see no more. This was too much. The crushing reality that I had very much ended up in some rupture of time and space, trapped here, perhaps forever, diminishing any sense of hope that remained within me. All day this went on, the ferry slowly continuing to fill up with more and more of these strange depictions of human beings. Usually they would board the ferry quietly, making their way to their seats and sitting down. But there was one notable exception to this rule. I would become painfully aware that night that not all who board this vessel are harmless. I had just finished the second of my sandwiches when I realized what was happening. Gradually, the ferry's motions became more violent, the boat rocking back and forth in clearly harsher seas. Yes, we had once again made our way out of the harbor. The tall waves outside began to lash at the sides of the ship as I felt the captain swinging a hard right. I looked out the window. We were sailing south, the land clearly visible out the starboard side. I cringed as we passed Bondi Beach, dark, twisted figures flailing around in the waters as fog once again thickened around us, and the frigid night air settled in. The ferry drifted on down the coast, shaking from side to side in by far the worst conditions I've ever experienced. The waves were monstrous now, and we weren't even that far out. Every so often I would shoot a glance out the other side of the ferry to see towering walls of water smashing up against us, water pouring through the windows and drenching the mindless drones in the seats beside them. The ferry was tipping violently from left to right, so dangerously close to capsizing I could see the surface of the ocean right outside my window before the vessel would swing back the other way. Yet somehow we remained topside. I was almost ready to jump up and run to the safety of my bathroom again when the ferry swung another hard right, coinciding with a massive crack of thunder and a blinding flash of lightning so loud I cowered on the floor in terror, uselessly trying to protect myself from being fried to death by a stray bolt from the skies. By the time I pulled myself back up and looked out my window again, all was calm. No more violent waves, no more rough seas. Everything was still and quiet. I stared out the window, the fog beginning to clear a little, and I noticed where we were. The ferry was sailing into Botany Bay. As the ferry slowed its pace, the engine reducing to a low drone, I saw things out the window that were just impossible. I stumbled up the stairwell, making my way over to the port side and sliding open the door to the upper deck. As we sailed along Prince Charles Parade, I looked up in absolute astonishment. I was staring at the 100-foot mast of a colonial-era British naval vessel, the Union Jack waving in the cold winds. As the ferry crept its way around this thing, I could see faces, peeking curiously over the deck at me, as if I were the out-of-place object in this situation. The size and the awe of this thing made me feel like little more than a mouse, but this was not the strangest thing I would see here. As we sailed slowly further down the coast, I saw men clad in formal military dress of an age gone by scurrying about the sands, shouting orders and waving their weapons in the air as people dressed in little more than rags trudged their way across the sands, their arms and legs chained. It had obviously dawned on me by this point, as unbelievably impossible as it was to accept, I was somehow witnessing the landing of the First Fleet. Another towering Navy ship up ahead dwarfed our tiny ferry, and feeling dizzy from the sheer enormity of it, I stumbled my way back inside, slumping down into my chair. I continued to watch out the window as this bizarre historical flashback unfolded before me. A little further down the bay, my stomach turned as I gazed upon the sickening sight of a group of prisoners on their knees, 2 soldiers standing before them, their weapons trained. I looked away, hiding my eyes and blocking my ears in anticipation of what this meant. I kept my senses as dulled as possible, as 5 distinct shots rang out through the night. I felt tears running through the cracks in my fingers as the reality of what had just happened echoed through my head. The frantic shouts of men snapped my attention back to the surreal happenings outside, and I saw one of them waving to the ferry, signaling it to stop, it would seem. I shuddered at the thought of this. Surely there was no way we would pull in here after what had just happened. A familiar creak of straining metal proved that hope woefully wrong, as the ferry swung around and began slowing as it neared the shoreline. I sunk back into my seat, making myself as small as possible. Slowly and carefully, I peeked out the window as I felt the ferry jerk to one side, its anchor hitting the floor of the bay. There stood Ramp Guy. He gave the anchor a couple of firm tugs before standing up and waving his arms in the air, as the men below wheeled a massive ramp of their own up along the shoreline, sliding its top edge over the deck of the ferry. I pulled my head away from the window again as I heard the sounds of chains making their way up the ramp, dragging across the deck, and eventually, a series of loud clangs as the chains fell free. "Thank you, officers," Ramp Guy said menacingly, the first time I'd actually heard him speak. I heard boots stomping back down the ramp and off into the distance, and soon after, the sound of the anchor being reeled back in. I felt almost relieved as the ferry began to pull away from this awful scene. That is, until I heard the sound of footsteps clunking up the stairwell toward me. I turned away, focusing my attention out the window, not wanting to look at who, or what, was coming up those stairs. In the vague reflection of the window, I noticed figures. Just outlines was all I could see, moving their way through the cabin. They took over 2 rows of seats behind me, a few rows back. There were numerous men, 4 or 5 in number, and they did not sound friendly. They spoke in Cockney accents, talking back and forth between themselves regarding their alleged crimes, which I will not repeat here. So heinous in nature they were. I tried to sink lower and lower in my seat, hoping I would go unnoticed, but, alas, after a few minutes of bantering between themselves, their voices became hushed. They began to talk in harsh whispers, ominous in tone, and with clearly sinister intent. Me, the obvious target of these intentions. My mind raced as I heard them stand up from their rows of seats. I looked around for anything I might use as a weapon to defend myself, but found nothing, settling in the end for the keys in my pocket. I carefully grabbed them out and firmly wedged one key between my fingers in a tightly clenched fist. I heard footsteps approaching, and I heard the men's voices erupt into a violent shout. I grabbed the back of the seat in front of me, about to get up and bury my makeshift weapon into whatever was standing before me, when all of a sudden the door to the captain's quarters swung open. I did not look, for what I saw merely out of the periphery of my vision was enough to dissuade me. Something tall, unnaturally so, stood in the doorway. I sat back down in my seat and stared straight ahead, refusing to look. My attackers stood frozen in place as this figure took heavy steps very slowly toward them, before coming to a halt a couple of steps away. I carefully shifted my eyes to the point I could just see what was happening. They were all standing about a foot behind me, so I could make out figures, but nothing more. This thing, it, whatever, was massive. The head brushed against the roof of the ceiling as it stared down at these men who cowered in fear before it. Up ahead, the captain stood firm behind the wheel, never wavering, just staring out into the dark seas before us. As I sat there, frozen in my place, I heard the sounds of footsteps, a group of them, tapping their way across the floor to the other side of the ferry. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw the 5 men ever so quietly take their seats and stare down at their feet. I quickly averted my eyes as massive footfalls began making their way back this way. I heard them stop, right beside me, and I felt something staring at me. I began to shake where I sat, praying this would just go away. And it was then a deep, awful voice spoke one word: interesting. Before walking away, the door to the captain's quarters slamming behind it. I broke down at this point, falling out of my chair and collapsing onto the floor. I stared at the ceiling, too exhausted to care about what was happening around me anymore. How in the hell was I here? What in the hell was happening? I curled up where I lay, watching out the upper rear doors as the ocean began to show its fury once again. I simply stared at the waves outside, mesmerized by their motion, wondering where on earth we were now until I finally managed to succumb to sleep. Boom! I was blasted out of sleep by an unusually loud eruption from the blower. Checking my watch, I saw it was around 2 in the morning. What the hell was going on now, I thought, as I pulled myself together and got up off the floor. I glanced over. The 5 men from earlier were still in their seats, hunched over and sleeping. I rubbed my eyes. Boom! What the? That wasn't from the ferry. It was too loud. The sounds from the ocean chop were louder now too, water ripping its way over the surface. Boom! Louder now, what the hell is doing that? I grabbed the sliding door to the deck and slid it open, stepping outside into the frosty night air. I noticed a bright light as I stepped out, grabbing the railing to steady myself, and I made my way up to the front of the upper deck. Boom! 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 In one panicked moment, my eyes rose up to meet the sight of the enormous cargo ship carving its way through the ocean straight towards us. There was no time to even think. I ran, and I dived off the side of that accursed ferry, smashing headfirst into the blackness of the Pacific Ocean. I wasted no time as I crashed through the surface. I flailed my arms and kicked my legs as fast as I possibly could, trying to swim down as deep as possible and put as much distance as I could between me and the monstrosity above me. I did not open my eyes, and I tried not to think about the sheer depth of what I was slowly disappearing into. I felt my body almost snap as I was violently pulled into a current of water as this thing flew past above me. I was suddenly enveloped in darkness as its massive form bulldozed over the ocean's surface, and I was tossed around like a rag in a washing machine for what felt like minutes on end, before being finally released, floating helplessly there in the depths. For whatever strength I had left, I pulled myself up toward the surface, the moonlit night thankfully giving me some form of direction. I kicked and swam with all my might until finally I broke through the surface. Immediately I began looking around for the wreck. I had to find something to grab onto. Some rogue piece of broken ferry that I could at least float on, or ideally a stray life jacket. I looked around as far as my eyes could see, searching for anything that might do the trick. No. I looked out toward the moonlit horizon. No. I snapped my eyes around to both sides. No. I shot a frantic look around behind me and in all directions. No. There was no wreck. There was no cargo ship. And the ferry was gone. Do you fear the water? I do. Of all the phobias which exist, I imagine this one is among the most common a lot of us share. I invite you to imagine just how it felt for me in that moment. Picture yourself in a deep yet relatively safe body of water, maybe a diving pool. You look down to see your legs dangling above the bottom of the pool, 16 feet down. Not scared yet? Okay. Now imagine the complex is empty, it's nighttime. You watch as the lights are all switched off one by one, and suddenly you are alone. All you can hear is the gentle swish of the water. And perhaps now there are subtle thoughts nagging at the back of your mind. Is the bottom still there? Which way is out? What's underneath me? Now take away the swimming complex. You're not there anymore. No, now you're floating in a lake. It's not huge. You can see the shoreline, and it's only around 20 feet deep. You know this lake well. You swim here often. Yet still, it is nighttime. There is no one else around you. And while the human part of your brain knows that there are no dangers in this lake, those primal fears that still dwell deep within your DNA makeup don't know that. What was that splash of water behind you? A small wave? Or something moving? But no, you know this lake. You know that you are safe. Now imagine you have no such comforts. You are kilometers offshore, floating in the rough seas of the South Pacific. There is over 13,000 feet of dark waters underneath you. It is the middle of the night, and you know without a shred of doubt that there are things swimming around underneath you. It is impossible to accurately describe the fear that one feels in that situation. So like I said, I invite you to attempt to imagine it. For the first few minutes on end, I was practically hyperventilating. Waves were rising up, smacking me across the face, and I was struggling to tread water and keep myself afloat. Such was my state of panic. I remember the pain in my neck as I snapped my head around every which way, frantically looking for any sign of hope, only to see an endless, dark horizon in every direction. I recall the moment I managed to somewhat calm my panicked mind, the dizziness subsiding, and my breath returning to something that resembled normal. That, of course, was the moment the true fear set in. That fight or flight mode tends to keep you distracted enough that you don't need to focus on the reality of the terrible situation you are in. It was when I calmed a little, began breathing steadily and treading water naturally, that it all hit me at once. I felt so small, quite literally a drop in the ocean. I tried so hard to stay focused, but all I could think about as I flailed there in the ocean was how quick and easy it would be for a great white shark to swim by and sink its teeth into my abdomen. I wouldn't even know it was coming. It was so dark, and the sounds of the wind and the waves would drown anything out. I would just be floating there whole 1 minute, then I would be a bleeding corpse the next. I thought about how pointless a death that would be. It's strange, but these are the things you think about when you are facing such a reality. Sharks don't even like the taste of humans. I wouldn't even be a satisfying meal for a hungry predator. I would just waste away out there, slowly disintegrating for nothing. And then it happened, shocking me out of my morbid thoughts, as though only to confirm them, a slight tickle on the bottom of my foot. I snapped backwards quickly, though I did not look down. I continued treading water, hoping, praying that whatever had just touched me had been a stray piece of seaweed or something harmless like that. I imagined my legs dangling down there. I imagined a mouth opening up as a tiger shark raced up from the depths, ready to close its jaws around my feet. I shook my head, trying to shake those awful thoughts from my mind. And there it was again. But not just a tickle this time, no, I felt something grasp around my ankle. I pushed myself backward again and took a few backstrokes away from where I was. What the hell was that? Something had just grabbed me. No shark can do that. I was quickly returning now to my panicked state, my primal brain screaming at me to get out of the water, but of course that not being an option. I told myself I had to keep calm and did so the best I could. I forced myself to breathe to a rhythm, and I forced myself to keep treading water slowly, to not thrash about, to conserve energy. Yet every few minutes or so, I would feel it again. That feeling of something slippery and slimy poking, grabbing and prodding at my feet and legs. For those arduous hours that I was out there in the blackness of the ocean, this thing's behavior continued. Every so often I would just start swimming. I don't know how far I got. The tide was strong and I could feel currents pulling me back the way I came. But no matter how far I thought I swam, this thing pursued me. At one point I felt the distinct sensation of some kind of tentacle wrapping around my thigh. I could feel it squeezing tighter, almost to the point that I could not kick that leg any further, and I almost resigned myself to drowning in that moment. I don't know what it was, and I still don't know why it let go. But that would be the last I felt of it. Minutes later, after what I can only estimate was around 3 hours stranded in the middle of the ocean alone, I heard a sound that I never imagined could bring me such comfort. Boom, boom! I looked around, and there it was, its bright spotlight shining straight on me. I was not ignorant to the fact that I was about to be going from the fire back into the frying pan. I was just grateful I was going to be out of the former. The ferry's engine slowed to a crawl as it began spinning around, turning to face the port side of the ship toward me. On deck stood 2 pale figures. I must impress, these figures, while humanoid, were clearly not human beings. For one thing, they were naked, yet featureless. Their faces blank slates. I mean, they did have faces. They were just devoid of any emotion or intent. I did wonder for a moment what these things' intentions were. Did they mean me harm? Were they here to finish me off? Were they here to simply taunt me as I continued flailing helplessly in the water until I inevitably drowned? Thankfully, none of these theories were true. As a second later, I watched them hurl a life ring out to me. The way they moved was bizarre. Every motion was in parallel unison with each other. Both arms swung out like a perfect mirror image as they threw the flotation device out to me. Then, after I grabbed on, they once again, in perfect unison, began reeling me in. When I reached the side of the ferry, they continued their bizarre, synchronized routine, reaching down and tossing over a rope ladder which I proceeded to climb up, dragging myself onto the deck of the ferry. Exhausted, I lay there for a few moments, thankful to be out of the water, yet painfully aware I had only prolonged the misery of my foreseeable destiny. After a minute or so laying there and catching my breath, I rolled over, reached out for the railing and pulled myself back up to my feet. I stood up to face these things. They stared at me, still standing side by side, a side-by-side reflection of each other almost perfectly. The difference now is that one did indeed have an expression on its face, and not a pleasant one. It stared at me with a scowl on its face. I didn't feel like I was in any immediate danger from these things, though. More than anything, he looked pissed off. I was just about to open my mouth and thank them, when out of nowhere he slapped me. Seriously, I shit you not. This thing, without a single change in expression, with zero hesitation, lifted its hand and slapped me across the face. I could only stare at this asshole, a look of absolute bewilderment on my face as they both turned and walked away. Once again, they moved in perfect sync with one another. I watched them round the corner out to the rear deck, and that was the last I ever saw of them. Jesus, just when I thought this ferry could get no weirder. I lifted a hand to my face, rubbing it slightly. My God, that hurt. I wouldn't have too long to dwell on it, though, as in that moment my eyes were drawn to an almighty crash from the ocean behind me. Water from whatever had been responsible for this disturbance splashed all over me, drenching the deck. I staggered back a little as the ferry itself creaked and groaned as it swung to one side, before crashing back down again. I rubbed the salty water from my eyes, my vision blurry, as I heard the ferry's engines roaring back to life. We began to pick up pace now, as I stumbled my way over to the railing, leaning over and glancing out into the ocean. There was no mistaking it this time. There was something massive beneath those waves. It moved with purpose, its form swaggering from side to side as it drifted through the water. Whatever it was, it did not seem capable of immense speed. It quickly fell behind the more the ferry picked up pace, powering away into the night. I thought of a couple of things in that moment. My first thoughts, of course, being the hours I had spent floating in those waters, with that thing poking and prodding at me. Had it been this giant which was taunting me all that time? And if so, why did it not pull me down into the depths with it? The second thought that crossed my mind were the ferry's seemingly random trips out to sea. Could it be the case that whatever this thing was hunting us? Were these back and forths out into deeper waters not random at all, and simply the captain trying to stay one step ahead of this monster? I did not know. All I knew in that moment was that I was glad I was not down there with it. Taking one last glance out to sea and noting the sun just beginning to peek its head over the distant horizon, I slid open the door to the cabin and stepped on back inside. It didn't take long then for the physical exhaustion to catch up with me. Adrenaline had worn off. My fight or flight response could keep my physical limitations from giving out no longer. My legs turned to jelly and I collapsed right there where I stood. I awoke a few hours later to a gentle hand shaking me. Honestly, I was tempted to just ignore whatever the hell it was and continue sleeping. Perhaps forever, such was the stink of death on me at this point. "Sir, it's almost closing time." Cafe Guy's voice was both a soothing presence and a harrowing reminder that I had once again awoken to yet another day of this nautical nightmare. I slowly sat up, stretching a little and rubbing my eyes before letting out a monstrous yawn. I noticed the ferry was idle once again, and I wondered where we might be. I was about to speak up in response when I was cut off by the obnoxiously loud PA system. "Attention passengers, we will be making our departure momentarily. The cafe service will close soon. A reminder to all, please remain inside the vessel and seated. If you need to stretch your legs or get some fresh air, please keep well away from the water. I repeat, no matter what you see, stay away from the water." Right. That was clearly directed at me, I thought. Apparently I had broken yet another weird rule. What the hell was I meant to do? There was a giant freaking cargo ship about to smash into us. Was I supposed to just stand there and die? Then again, that clearly had been some kind of hallucination. Or was it? I quite literally felt it roar past above me when I was down there. "Sir, I must insist that we move things along." I glanced up, realizing Cafe Guy was holding out a hand to me. I grabbed hold and he helped me up off the floor. My clothes were still all damp and I stunk like a wet dog. "Thanks, mate," I said, as I struggled to find my footing, my body still very weak. "Come on, let's fix you something to eat." Cafe Guy spoke warmly, smiling that trademark smile. He really did have something of a calming effect among all this madness. I followed him over to the cafe counter and without even asking, he began cooking up a variety of different pastries, fresh sandwiches, and salads. I didn't care what he was making for me. I was ravenous enough to eat absolutely anything by this stage. My energy levels were near on non-existent, so my legs could attest to as I fell backwards into a row of seats. Cafe guy noticed this, glancing over at me with a somber look of concern on his face. Before long, he finished up what he was doing and packed all his creations into a bag for me, bringing it over along with a steaming hot cup of coffee. I was grateful for his presence on this otherwise awful ferry. It was nice to know I had a friend, despite everything else. "Here you are, sir," he said, handing me the food and the coffee. I didn't even wait, grabbing out one of the beef and potato pies and taking a voracious chomp into its hearty goodness. I realized part way through my shameless display that cafe guy was staring at me. He wasn't annoyed or anything, no, for the first time he actually looked like he was trying to hold back laughter. "Oh my God. I'm sorry, geez. Thanks, mate, I appreciate it. It's really good." I stammered out, laughing a little myself as I did so and taking a sip of my coffee in an attempt to bridge myself back into a state of civility. Cafe guy chuckled softly and shook his head a little, but after a moment that spark of happiness left his face. He suddenly looked somber again, and he just stared for a moment before speaking up again. "You need to be more careful, young man. You're lucky we found you all the way out there. I'm sure you know this by now, but there are more to these waters we sail than meets the eye." Finishing up my mouthful of pie, I nodded my head in response. "Yeah, I sure do. I saw something down there early this morning after they pulled me out of the water. It was huge. I'm pretty sure whatever it was had been trying to grab me when I was in the ocean too," I said, turning to face him now. Cafe guy slowly shook his head before looking me in the eyes as he spoke again. "If one of those wanted to take you, you'd be gone." I froze upon hearing those words. So many things running through my brain all at once. There was more than one? What were they? What was their purpose? And if it wanted to take me, is that the only reason I'm still breathing? Because this thing was in a good mood? The weight I felt in that moment was crushing, thinking back to my helpless self floating in that water. I shuddered at the thought of it. Cafe guy noticed this and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. He spoke once more in that calming tone of his. "Don't you dwell on it, sir. Things have a way of working out in the end," he said, before taking a glance down at his watch. He stood up, walking back over to the cafe and crouching down. He pulled out his set of keys and opened up a small locker beneath the counter. He pulled out a neatly packed bag before locking back up, standing up and walking back over to me. "I have a feeling you need these more than me," he said, looking down at my still damp clothes. "They're clean and freshly washed. They should fit you. No need to give them back. I shan't be needing them." I glanced back at him, smiling a little myself now. "Thanks, mate. I appreciate you. I mean, I still don't know what your deal is here, but you've been kind to me. And if by some miracle I make it back to the real world, I won't forget it," I said to him before reaching out my hand to shake his. He accepted my gesture, firmly shaking my hand before turning and walking away. So there I was again, just me and the ferry, and the ever-increasing number of strange passengers boarding it. I had given up hope of trying to get off this thing. If what I experienced in the sea was any indication of what the world outside had become, it seemed that I was safer in here than I was out there. For now, though, I just wanted to get comfortable. Placing my bag of food down on my row of seats, I took the clothes cafe guy had given me and made my way downstairs to the bathroom to get changed. As I stepped down off the final step, I scanned the lower level of the ferry, noticing that both sides had now almost filled up. There must have been some more stops in the time that I was floating out there. Looking around the crowd, I noticed that some of the passengers we were picking up were looking less and less human. In the beginning, when I first noticed this shift in appearance, it was just subtleties. Like I said, the kind of human-like appearance you get from an AI image generator. But now this was even more pronounced. Some of the figures seated in the back right-hand rows had these thick, rubbery-looking heads sporting blank, almost faceless expressions as they turned their gaze toward me. Others were very unnaturally tall and thin, looking like they had been placed between two giant vice clamps and forcibly stretched out. Then some among the crowd had almost no human appearance whatsoever, humanoid in shape being as close as they got. Many of them looked to have been pulled straight from the sea just as I was, their bodies covered in seaweed with clams and barnacles still hanging off soggy flaps of skin. I quickly looked away from these humanoid nothing people, as I had come to refer to them, as I noticed almost all of them were staring at me now. They were making me feel uneasy, and I didn't like it. The fact that they just sat there and stared was in some ways worse than if they had been doing anything outright malicious. I slipped my way past the back row of seats, shivering as my arm brushed against the scraggly mess of dank, wet hair belonging to one of the passengers. I quickened my pace, rounding the corner and shutting myself inside the bathroom to change. Opening up the bag, I found a set of blue jeans and a white polo shirt. Very casual, I thought. Thanks, cafe guy. I quickly changed into the dry clothes, stepped out and chucked my now surely ruined set into the trash. I sighed as I glanced out over the deck. We were back in Sydney Harbor once again, a sight I once cherished every time I laid eyes on it. But now, a landscape of pure dread. There was no one out there now. I don't mean like the first couple of times where I could at least see shadows of people in the distance. This time there was just no one. I woefully turned my gaze away from this depressing landscape and made my way back upstairs to my row of seats. The upper floor was now my one and only safe haven away from the nothing people. Even the group of convicts that had tried to attack me last night had now made their way down the stairs to join the rest of them, neatly sat in rows, all facing straight ahead, aside from their dopey stares toward me whenever I would show myself around them. It seemed the only time they ever broke from this trance was to herd themselves up the stairs and get their morning meals. Sitting down in my little corner, I grabbed out a sandwich and started munching away as the ferry made its way through the harbor once again. I wasn't even all that shocked anymore, as I glanced out at the rotting scenery around me. Once again, same as yesterday, the ferry started pulling into various ports, and again they looked absolutely nothing like I had once known them to. The Maritime Museum wharf, which proudly houses the HMAS Vampire, now featured only the decaying hull of a ship half sunken in the harbor. As we began to sail out of the harbor and back toward the Parramatta River, I dared not look as we passed by Goat Island, seeing enough merely out of the corners of my vision to deter me from directly looking at whatever horrors were stomping their way across the shores. They were massive, whatever the hell they were, and I shifted away from the window and into one of the center rows of seats, afraid that they might reach out for me. Onwards we sailed up and down the river and around and about the harbor, continuing this now monotonous routine of pulling into random stops, some I didn't even know existed, and picking up more travelers. I stayed put right where I was, but every time a new group of them would board, my eyes stayed locked on the stairwell ahead of me, silently praying that none of them would make their way up here again. It must have been nearing about 4 p.m. that day when it happened. I was out on deck getting some fresh air, just watching out over the water ahead, when I noticed the ferry was picking up speed. It was moving unusually fast, and this frightened me, but not near as much as what came next. I gripped the rail tight as the ferry began to turn, our heading now directed straight into the bank of the river. I thought this must be a mistake. I was sure that at any moment we would adjust our course back out into open space. But we didn't. We only picked up speed. We were about 20 meters from the shoreline now, and I was just about to jump off the side again when I remembered the words from earlier. Please keep well away from the water. I repeat, no matter what you see, stay away from the water. Now mere moments away from smashing into the shoreline, I grabbed the railing as tight as I possibly could, bracing for the oncoming impact. And then suddenly my grip loosened as my eyes met the impossible sight ahead of me. With an unearthly groan, the land itself began to morph before my very eyes. Within seconds, a new passage of water had opened up, a mass of twisted mangroves forming a tunnel around it. At speed, we blasted through the opening as a crash of thunder erupted from the sky, much like when we had entered Botany Bay, and I cringed in terror once again, fearing I may be struck down by lightning. But all was quiet, and the ferry began to slow its pace now. As I rose back up to my feet, I looked around in astonishment at the surroundings we now found ourselves within. We were trekking through a mangrove-ridden swampland, the buzz of mosquitoes and the stink off the muddy riverbank thick in the air. I was well-traveled, and there was only one place in this country I had witnessed this kind of scenery. A soft clunk against the hull of the ferry, and the swish of a thick reptilian tail disappearing beneath the water confirmed what I was thinking. We were not in Sydney anymore. We were traversing through a northern mangrove river. My head began to spin. I'm not sure why. Surely I should be used to this madness by now, but somehow this damned ferry managed to up the stakes yet again. I stumbled backward, turning around to go back inside when I was met with the sight of yet another crocodile. This one, its head slightly elevated out of the water, as they tend to do before they jump, its jaws open slightly. I kept my eyes locked on it, ready to throw myself backward should it make a move, but not wanting to be the one to move first and startle it into striking. The ferry gurgled along through this murky hellscape as the world around me became progressively weirder. Dark mists were now rising up out of the water, and more creatures began swimming around, circling the vessel. The more I got a good look at them, the more I realized how wrong I had been. They were not crocodiles. Too big. Even the most monstrous of crocs ever seen in Australia capped out at around 8.5 meters. These things circling the boat were at least twice that, looking more like the ancient Sarcosuchus than a modern-day crocodilian. I took another couple of steps back, and suddenly, the PA system crackled to life again. "Attention, for your own safety, remain inside the ferry. Stay away from the water and do not look outside." They didn't need to tell me twice. I quickly yet quietly made my way back inside and took my seat again, this time keeping my eyes front. For hours we sailed through this natural maze until I finally felt the ferry begin to swing into a stop. Once again, the PA system exploded with static. "Attention! Remain inside the vessel. Keep your eyes closed, I repeat. Keep your eyes closed." Catching sight of the long, twisted jetty winding out from within the dark mangroves ahead, and the barest glimpse of the tall, stretched-out nothing people lined up along it, I did exactly what the PA voice instructed. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly and did everything I could to turn my focus away from what was outside. A screeching sound rang out as the ferry swung into dock, followed by the regular clangs out on deck as Ramp Guy hurled the now busted-up metal footbridge out onto the pier for these awful things to board the ship. I could hear quiet whispers, along with the soft buzz of insects and the lapping of the water against the shoreline. I then heard the tapping of what sounded like sharp-pointed feet, clicking their way across the ramp. And finally, I heard the sound of the ramp being pulled back in and the gates latching shut. The ferry then floated there for a few minutes as I listened to the new arrivals getting seated downstairs, their whispers now fading away as they no doubt joined the rest of the mindless drones in their ever-present state of nothingness. Once I could hear them no more and was satisfied that they were of no threat to me, I opened my eyes. Please don't be real, I thought, as I immediately shut my eyes once again. Something was looking straight at me. Through the window, right next to my head. The window which was only half closed, leaving no barrier between us. I dared not continue to look, but what I saw was enough. It was clung to the windowsill, its face half pressed against the glass. The rest of its body hung limp across the deck of the ferry, its legs dangling out over the side. I pressed my eyes shut as tightly as I could, as I felt its breath on my neck, and heard it whispering between breaths. "Can you help me?" it said, between ragged breaths. I slid myself over to the farthest seat in the row I was in, but even then I could still feel its breath, and I could now feel its hand, sliding up against me as if it were desperately trying to grab onto me. "Please help me," it spoke again. I once again felt a slimy hand uselessly attempting to grasp at my arm. I was crying silent tears now. I wanted to get up and run, but I did not know what else was around me. Perhaps I would be running straight into another of its kind. "Help me." It spoke just one more time as the ferry began to pull away from the jetty, and I heard it slide off the deck and plop into the water. Its fate from that point, I do not know. Not once did I open my eyes again as the ferry continued sailing through this otherworldly land. Every so often I would hear the ferry pick up pace, followed by that familiar crash of thunder again, before slowing down and continuing to make more stops. All the while I could hear things boarding the vessel. Some would speak in tongues I could not possibly understand. Others spoke in languages I recognized but did not know. Spanish, Mandarin, a variety of Asian and European languages, as well as many others. I would hear the odd American or British accent, and in amongst it all I would also hear terrifying voices, mixtures of groans, clicks, and gurgles. All manner of specimens were being herded onto this ferry. But for what? I had no idea, nor did I really want to know anything about what was happening around me. It wasn't until we were back in Sydney Harbor that I opened my eyes again, and how I wish I had not. The ferry picked up pace, roaring through yet another of these portal things, and once we were through, I heard the familiar sounds of the harbor once more, feeling comfortable enough to look outside. First glance was not enough. I had to be certain of what I was seeing. I closed my eyes, shook my head, and looked again. As the ferry slowly sailed down the harbor, a terrible sight lay before me. Sydney was no more. I mean, it was there, kind of. The beautiful cityscape I had gazed upon so many times was now an apocalyptic wasteland. The Sydney Tower, once standing proudly high above the city, had been snapped off midway up. The buildings were in ruins. The Sydney Harbour Bridge lay in shambles, broken off in the center and each side hanging downward. I watched in horror as hordes of these nothing people wandered across the decaying bridge from both ends, toppling into the harbor as they reached the tipping point in the center. The Opera House, once a proud symbol of our beautiful city, now lay in pieces, its iconic sails scattered all over. I turned away from this nightmare, forcing my eyes to look at anything else, but what I saw inside was no better. The ferry was almost full now. Many more nothing people had entered the vessel during our ventures down that river, and wherever the hell else we had been. All over the world, by the sounds of things. The upper floor was no longer my safe haven away from them, as it too was now almost full, the entire opposite side now filled with figures taking all manner of forms, all of them staring squarely at me. I looked away from them, feeling uneasy yet relatively assured that if the previous days were any indication, once they were boarded and seated, they meant me no harm. The ferry continued to sail up and down the harbor, and a few more stops and pickups were made. All the while I tried my best to relax, to sit back and not draw any attention to myself. And I managed to do just that. Even as my own side of the ferry began to fill up with boarding travelers, I somehow managed to keep my head. That was until the end of the day. It was around 7 p.m. that night when the ferry went down. No, I don't mean it powered down for the night. I mean it dropped straight down. Any composure I had managed to maintain went out the window as I tucked myself down in my seat, preparing for the rush of cold water to pour in through the open doors and windows, trapping us all in this underwater coffin. But it didn't. I was instead suddenly surrounded by utter silence, save for a dull wind audible, yet I could feel nothing on my skin through the windows. I slowly raised my head and opened my eyes, noticing the pitched black night sky outside. Had I imagined what just happened? I could have sworn to God this ferry had just dropped straight down underneath the water. I saw it. I felt it happen. But alas, there was the night sky right there. I could not hear the typical sounds of the harbor anymore, and I wondered if we were even still in Sydney. I got up from my seat, intending to take a look outside at what was going on. Slowly, I slid open the door to the starboard side deck, and I very carefully stepped out, painfully aware of the many hidden threats that may lie waiting out there. What met my eyes this time, however, was so much worse than anything I had yet seen on this journey. As I gazed over the side of that ferry, seeing no water at all beneath us and observing the green and blue ball suspended in vast black nothingness, slowly disappearing into the darkness we were now floating off into, I realized with a dizzying horror. Not only were we not in Sydney Harbor anymore, we were not even on Earth anymore. My big brother had been missing for a year. It all started when he went out of town for a job interview. He kept in touch through our family chat room on his way there, right up until he sat in the company's waiting room. "They're calling my name. Wish me luck." That was his last message. Nothing has been heard from him since. We called his number. It rang, but no one answered. We checked his social media, but there were no updates for a year. My brother Eric vanished into thin air. A job interview out of town didn't sound alarming. None of us, Mom, Dad, or I, bothered to ask which town or company he was heading to. We'll ask when he gets the job, we thought. It took me a year to gather the courage to go through his belongings. That's when I finally pieced together his destination, Callisto, a small town 2 hours west of our parents' house. Callisto was tiny compared to our city. After a year, the odds of finding a trace of him were slim, but I just couldn't let it go. I had to try. So I went to Callisto. The town was quaint, with barely a skyscraper in sight. As I drove around, I tried to imagine what company a civil engineering graduate like my brother might have been interviewing with. There were a few likely places, but it wasn't as if I could just walk in and ask if they remembered him. It had been a year. While driving aimlessly, I passed a zoo. It was surprisingly large for a town of this size. Then I noticed the name engraved on its curved gate. Empty Zoo. Weird, I thought. Who names a zoo empty? Something clicked in my memory. I remembered I saw something when I looked through all Eric's work stuff. I pulled out a folder where my brother kept all his documents related to the companies he'd had interviews with. There was a piece of paper, the size of a business card. One word was written in large all-capital letters on one side. Empty. I flipped the paper to check the other side. Blank. Empty. Weird. Did Eric have an interview at a zoo called Empty? Curiosity got the better of me and I parked the car. The ticketing booth was deserted and the gate was unlocked. I wasn't trying to trespass, but something about this place called to me. The zoo was eerie. Every cage I saw housed only one kind of animal. Monkeys. Dozens of them, but no other species. What kind of zoo has only monkeys? I muttered under my breath. The monkeys noticed me and became agitated. They reached out, waving their hands inward as if pleading for help. Weird and creepy. Then I passed one cage and a particular monkey caught my attention. Unlike the others, this one monkey appeared to be more hysterical than the rest. It reached its hand out of the cage, but I noticed something odd. Instead of waving in like the others, this one monkey's hand was waving out as if urging me to leave. That's when I saw it. It felt completely inappropriate, but for some reason, I felt like there was a similarity between that monkey and my lost brother Eric. I took a closer look. The monkey had something that looked like a birthmark on its left cheek. Brown, butterfly-shaped. It was huge, almost covering its entire left cheek. Weirdly enough, my brother had exactly the same birthmark. Brown, butterfly-shaped, covering his left cheek. I froze. The monkey grew more frantic. Its hand kept waving outward, even more vigorously than before. I backed away, my heart pounding. The creepy and eerie feeling was strong, so I immediately turned around and bolted out of the zoo. It was already dark, so I had to find a hotel to stay for the night. That night, I wrote about my experience on my personal blog. Within an hour, when I checked it back, there were 56 comments. Never in my life had I gotten 56 comments on my blog in an hour. Every single comment shared the same story. They had their family, wives, husbands, friends, colleagues, whatever, leave town to attend a job interview and then went missing. 32 of them were trying to look for their missing relatives, visiting the said town, all in 32 different towns, and happened to encounter a zoo with the same name, Empty. A zoo with the same weird name displaying only monkeys. And there are monkeys that, for some reason, somehow appeared to resemble their missing relatives. This is truly horrifying. I couldn't get ahead of it, so I was thinking of returning to the zoo just a few hours later to investigate further. I had a strong urge to find my missing brother. So I walked out of my hotel room, and in the dead of night, I drove back to the zoo. It was located not too far from the hotel where I stayed, just a few blocks away. In the distance, I could see a long, high wall with a glimpse of a curved gate. It was dark, so I couldn't see clearly, but I was sure it was the gate with the words Empty Zoo engraved on it. I kept driving until I passed the gate and peeked inside to see if anyone was guarding it. It was a zoo. There should be a security guard or something. If he didn't let me pass, I should at least ask him something about the zoo. I looked through the gate, into the area where the zoo should be. It was empty. No zoo. Nothing. I shifted my gaze to the curved gate where Empty Zoo should have been. Blank, no text, nothing. What the hell? I parked my car abruptly and got out. As I got closer to the gate, I saw someone standing right behind it. He appeared to be smoking. "Excuse me, sir," I called out to him. "Yeah, what can I help you with?" he responded. He looked like a security guard. "The zoo. Where's the zoo?" I asked, his brows furrowed. "What zoo?" "A zoo. I was here this afternoon, just a few hours ago. No one was guarding the ticketing booth and the gate was open. So I took a walk inside. There were only monkeys in it, no other animals," I explained. The security guard looked stunned. "Sir, there was no zoo here. Never was," he said. I was about to complain, but something came to mind. Maybe I took a wrong turn. "Oh, my bad. Where's the zoo then?" "Maybe I took a wrong turn," I said. "No zoo, sir. This town just celebrated its 42nd birthday last week, and we've never had a zoo in 42 years. "No way," I shouted in shock. "But I was here just a few hours ago." "What time was it, if I may ask?" 4 p.m. "Sir, I work a double shift today. I've been here since 2 p.m. I didn't see anyone entering. Not you, not anyone." The security guard looked concerned. "I'm not sure if I should tell you this, sir," he said slowly and carefully. "But you're not the first one to ask about a zoo." "No? No, sir. I've been working here for 4 years. We've never had a zoo here. But over those 4 years, countless people have come here asking me about a zoo. When they ask about it, it's always their second time coming. The first time was hours earlier, and they trespassed the gate because no one was guarding it. They claimed there was a zoo here with only monkeys in it." "Just like me," I said. "Yes, sir. Just like you." I froze, my blood ran cold. I don't know what happened here, sir. It's strange and creepy for me, too. Having experienced countless people coming, asking for exactly the same thing that was never here. The security guard paused for a while, seeming uncertain. This place belonged to a billionaire entrepreneur. He tried selling or renting this place for years. I was a security guard and he didn't talk business with me, so I heard this weird thing from someone else. Heard what? That he actually rented this place to a zoo, and it has been 8 years now. But I repeat, never saw any zoo here. I shivered. Then something suddenly popped into my head. Does he own another location this huge in another town? I asked. I mean, he's a billionaire entrepreneur. The security guard seemed to hesitate. As far as I'm concerned, sir, yes. He owns other locations just as huge in other towns. I don't know how many of them really, but we guards talk to each other. He paused, seeming somehow terrified. Guess what he rented those locations to? A zoo? I took a guess. Yes, sir, he replied, a zoo. All of them. He rented the locations to a zoo, the same zoo company on paper. What do you mean on paper? I frowned. The guard glanced around nervously before leaning in. On paper, they were all rented to a zoo. In reality, the security guard turned his head around to look toward the empty lot inside the gate. They were all just like this. Empty. I was driving home late one night after a long shift, the kind that left me drained to my very core. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and quiet, an endless ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the thick darkness surrounding it. My headlights barely cut through the heavy fog, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered like restless spirits. All I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget how exhausted I was. The car's tires roared steadily against the pavement, a monotonous sound that should have been soothing. Instead, it only amplified the unease slowly creeping into my chest. I'd taken this route countless times, but something about tonight felt different. The air felt colder. I shook my head, blaming the fatigue. Then it happened. A chill ran down my spine, sharp and unnatural, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Instinctively, I slowed the car. My eyes strained against the fog, and that's when I saw her, a figure at the edge of the road. My heart jumped into my throat. She stood still, pale as moonlight, barely distinguishable from the fog. I couldn't make out her features, but she looked like a woman, her long, tangled hair fluttering in the wind. It didn't make sense. There was no wind. Something about her posture, the way she seemed to float inches above the ground, froze me in place. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as an overwhelming urge to drive away gripped me. Yet I sat there, staring, unable to move. She didn't wave, didn't call for help. She simply stood there, staring into the darkness as though I didn't exist. A voice inside me screamed to keep driving, to leave her behind and not look back. But my body refused to obey. My pulse pounded in my ears as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I don't know how long I sat there, but I suddenly found myself whispering the only thing that came to mind, a prayer my late grandmother had taught me when I was a child. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words tumbled out of my mouth, shaky at first, but growing stronger with each repetition. I wasn't even sure I believed in such things anymore, but at that moment it was all I had. The prayer steadied me, gave me the courage to press my foot down on the gas and move forward. My car inched past her, and I resisted the primal urge to look at her face. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, something terrible would happen. As I drove on, the figure faded into the shadows, swallowed by the fog. I kept whispering the prayer under my breath, clinging to it like a lifeline. I didn't dare glance in the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. Every horror movie I'd ever watched played out in my mind, and I cursed myself for ever enjoying them. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, I repeated again and again. The rhythmic repetition helped calm my nerves as I focused on the road ahead. The drive home felt like an eternity, each mile stretching longer than the last. The darkness outside seemed to press against the car windows, suffocating and oppressive. Finally, I saw the familiar glow of my porch light in the distance. Relief washed over me like a wave, and I pulled into the driveway so quickly I nearly hit the fence. Shaking, I turned off the engine and grabbed my bag, practically leaping out of the car. The cold night air hit me, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting inside, locking the door and putting this nightmare behind me. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the front door. They trembled so badly that I dropped them once, then twice. I cursed under my breath, still whispering the prayer as if it would somehow shield me. The words had become a mantra, an anchor in a sea of panic. When I finally got the door open, I stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind me. The faint glow from the street lamp outside spilled into the hallway, offering just enough light to navigate. I didn't bother turning on the living room lights. I just needed to get to my bedroom and feel the safety of my walls around me. But as I reached for the light switch near the door, something stopped me. I don't know what it was, an instinct, a presence, a sense of being watched, but I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head ever so slightly. That's when I saw her. Again. She was standing in the darkness just a few feet away from me. Her wet hair hung in long, stringy strands clinging to her face. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, locked onto mine with a look that sent ice through my veins. And her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, stretching unnaturally across her face. I couldn't move. My legs felt like jelly, my body paralyzed by fear. Smiling, she tilted her head to one side, then the other, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed almost playful. The grin on her face grew wider, impossibly wide, and then, to my horror, she spoke in a sing-song tone. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she said, her voice a chilling mockery of my prayer. My knees buckled and I stumbled back against the door. She took a step closer, her bare feet soundless against the floor. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Each repetition was ended with an eardrum-piercing laughter, louder, more distorted, as though her voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for the light switch, desperate to banish the darkness. I flipped the switch, flooding the room with light, and she was gone. I sank to the floor, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. The prayer still lingered on my lips, but the words felt hollow now, meaningless. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, locking every door and window in the house before retreating to my bedroom. I left the lights on, unwilling to face the darkness again. Even now, as I have finished this story, I'm too afraid to go to sleep. For as long as I could remember, I'd always struggled to believe the way I was supposed to. Back when I was 16, I was hard on my parents, testing my limits to see how far I could push them. I saw them as oppressive, not willing to engage with anything that made them uncomfortable. But now that I'm older, I can appreciate that they were trying their best. They didn't have all the answers, but thought that as parents and good Christians, they should. Fake it till you make it and all that. And in return, I was supposed to accept their word at face value, as was the natural order between parents and their children. You'll do as I say because I said so, and that is that. But then my brother disappeared and the natural order of everything crumbled. Brian normally came home from band practice at the same time each day, but on April 12, 2015, I didn't hear his keys jingle as he unlocked the door. Didn't hear his old beater pulling up into the driveway. Didn't hear any gripes about how the girl on first chair wouldn't shut up about her new strings. I think about that first evening so often. How I'd told myself that he was just running a bit late. Normally, when that happened, he gave us all a heads up. Since I was grounded again, I had to ask Dad if he'd gotten any texts. Nothing. Not on my phone or his. Brian normally came home at 6 o'clock. The clock chimed 7, then 8, then 9. While Mom, Dad, and I waited to hear his car, his voice, the phone ring, anything, that was when it began. The quiet. The thing no one tells you about when someone you love doesn't come home is how the silence that fills the air where their laughter should be is louder than any scream. You should be hearing their footsteps in the hall. You should be arguing over who used up all the hot water in the shower and put Dad in a bad mood. There should be a light on in his room as he listens to his metal music that our parents tolerate because, if that's Brian's way of rebelling, I'll take it. The quiet kills you. That first night when Mom called the police, her voice was hushed as if afraid that speaking too loudly would make the nightmare real. As long as we didn't talk about it, it wasn't as bad as we thought. Just a misunderstanding. He was running late, that was that. Hours turned into days. More muted conversations with the police, both Mom and Dad looking at me to make sure I couldn't hear. However, their faces told me more than words ever could. In just the span of a few days, they looked much older. I aged too. Everyone in town and members of our church banded together to go on searches. He was probably just lost in the woods, probably just at a friend's house. You know how boys are at that age. It didn't matter that Brian wasn't like that. It's just how boys are, because it's better than the alternative. Days of oblivion, not knowing if Brian was alive or dead, became weeks. The searches kept going, but less and less people showed up to call his name in the faint hope that something besides the coyotes would answer. He was just lost in the woods. He would turn up eventually. Even though I never saw the appeal of the music that he liked to listen to, I would sneak into his room at night, turn on the CD player. If his music was playing, he wasn't gone. He was just in the room right next to mine. I knew exactly where he was. We knew exactly where he was. One night, I caught Dad sneaking in to sit on his bed. The silence was broken as the man that I used to think of as authoritative and unbreakable caved in on himself, trying to muffle his sobs with Brian's pillow. I came in and joined him, hugging him as tightly as I could. Mom followed soon after, embracing us both, her sobs accompanying ours. The pillow still had his scent, like he was right there, trapped within the threads, buried too deep where we couldn't reach him. It was at this point that I had begun to pray, despite all of my unanswered questions and skepticism. I didn't know what else to do. If Brian couldn't answer us when we called his name, maybe God would. Just this once. 3 months after Brian's disappearance, he was found. I will never forget the way my mother howled his name, over and over, as if her grief would be enough to call him back to where he belonged. It doesn't matter how long it's been. I can't say what happened to him. I just can't. He wasn't just murdered. Thinking about what was done to him makes me want to dig up the man that took him from us and hammer his bones into powder. Death wasn't enough for him. Nothing was enough for him. Clearly, I wasn't the only one that felt that way. When Brian's abductor was found, he didn't last very long behind bars. Reportedly, before giving him his due, one of the members of his lynch mob told him, "If you ain't a praying man now, you will be by the time we're done with you." That's where the problem came in. He did pray. He pleaded for forgiveness, not from the mob, not from my family, not even from Brian. God's kingdom is open to all, even the depraved, the unkind, the hateful, even to people like him. All that is required for the gates to open and to feel the warmth of his love is to ask for his forgiveness. And ask he did. But what did that mean for Brian? How could his soul possibly find rest if the one who sent him to heaven before his time was right there with him? This was one of the many questions that haunted me. But back before he was taken away from us, it had just been a thought experiment with no real stakes. What if a hypothetical victim was trapped in what should have been paradise with their hypothetical killer? Just a word problem, like in math class. If John had 12 apples and Judy takes 8, and Sarah gives him 4 times the amount of that, does that doom him to spend an eternity with the man that brutalized him? For Brian's sake, I had to know if that was true, but I wouldn't dare ask that question. My parents had been through enough. To this day, and as a parent myself now, I still don't know how they did it. How they were able to wake up each morning knowing that one of their babies was going in the ground. So without voicing that terrible question to a single soul, I prayed for Brian to find peace. Along with that, I prayed for an answer, though I didn't expect one. However, I did receive one. And it wasn't from God. On the day of the funeral, I'm ashamed to admit that I was afraid to go to the casket, even though it was closed. Dad's eyes were empty as he held my mom, who'd had her face buried in his chest since we arrived. If she didn't look, it wasn't real. Likewise, I stood at the end of the long carpet leading up to where the casket sat, overwhelmed by the hushed chatter and terrible organ music playing through the church's crackling speakers. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't him. It was just a body. No, it wasn't even a body. It was a wax figurine inside, modeled to look like him. A dummy, a fake. Even better, the casket was empty, and this all was just a dream. My cheeks were wet. My eyes burned, the golden lights in the church becoming beams. I couldn't breathe. My feet had sprouted roots that burrowed to the center of the earth. They wouldn't move. If you forget to say goodbye, you'll regret it. The same priest I've known since childhood. Despite how tender and gentle his voice was, I didn't want to accept his hand when he offered it. I didn't want to go. Even though he was most likely right, the roots in my legs were stuck firm. I closed my eyes. His hand disappeared into mist, leaving my palm damp and cold. The quiet weighed on my ears to the point of pain. When my eyes opened, the church was empty. No priest, no mom and dad. The church looked completely different in the dark. Larger. Or maybe I had gotten smaller somehow. Either way, I didn't feel welcome. The only thing that remained was the coffin. Standing up now. Facing me. Izzy. Brian's nickname for me. I used to hate it, but before that moment I would have given anything to hear it again. He was whispering from inside, his voice echoing in the hollow, deserted sanctum. His voice sounded strange, raspy, dry. My hands shook. I couldn't move. "It's not right," he continued, his voice cracking in a way that made me want to shatter like glass. "It's not like they said." I opened my mouth, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Scream, speak, neither happened. The roots had grown upwards to take over my vocal cords as well. That was when the air changed in the room. Like the electric tension in the atmosphere before a storm arrives. My hair stood on end. Automatically, I knew where the lightning had struck, turning my head to see not a bolt of electricity but a girl. The girl was the same age as me, maybe a bit older. She was slouched, staring at a glittering blue rosary tangled around her fingers as if it was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Brian's murmurs continued as I fought to get my body to do something. Anything but just stand there. "We don't have much time, Isabel," said the girl plainly, her head slowly turning to meet my gaze. "They'll come looking for him soon." As if she'd broken a spell, my legs finally moved. On their own accord, they guided me to sit next to her. She didn't blink or move as I approached her. Once I'd slid into the pew, I spoke for the first time that day. The words scratchy as if being played from a broken radio. "Is this real?" Letting the rosary drop, swining in her long fingers, the girl gingerly reached forward to use her thumb to wipe my tears away. Her hands felt clammy on my flushed cheeks, face hot from how much I'd been crying. It certainly felt real. "Izzy." Brian's sobs were constant. Her eyes. The girl's eyes were strange. She gazed through me, into me, stripping away skin, muscle, bone. "Who are you?" I asked. She didn't blink. Those peculiar eyes continued to dig into each and every atom of my being as she said softly, "When you were a little girl, you used to beg your mom to keep the hall light on. You'd get a running start and jump onto your bed, thinking that I was hiding underneath, waiting to grab you." Heart pounding, I started to pull away from her, knowing now who I was speaking to. The girl's voice came out as a whisper, "And you were right. Run." I had to run. She stayed seated, observing me as I raced for where the exit should have been. Brick. The door was gone. Brian was crying quietly from his coffin. Even though I grew up going to that church, it had changed, becoming a brick cage. No doors. The windows were dark as if the world outside had vanished, leaving only the sanctum. The girl waited patiently as I searched for some way out. Any way out. She'd gone back to examining her rosary, completely apathetic. In the meantime, Brian had begun to plead with me again. "He's with me. It happens over and over again. I can't get away, please." "Does that answer your question?" The girl's voice floated over his agonized whimpers as she continued to toy with the cross. "About what the kingdom is like?" The words came out of my mouth without a thought. "Oh my God." "He loves you," the girl muttered distantly as she rose from the pew. "He loves everyone, every saint, every sinner, even the ones he sends to me. You're all equal in his eyes, even when you aren't. The hammer is the nail, and as long as they love him back and plead his forgiveness, they will stay together." My voice came back, angry and bereaved, as she spoke each word with the cold detachment of stating a simple fact. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" "You wanted an answer," she replied as she came to stand in front of me. She was much taller, though her overwhelming presence made her seem even larger. "And I want souls. Your brother isn't in a position to offer his anymore. Only the living have that luxury. You'll have to do it for him." My heart beat even faster, my breath coming quicker as the weight of her words finally clicked within my frantic brain. "You can't be serious." Her face betrayed no emotion. "Shall I let the angels take him back?" At that, Brian's pleading became more urgent, begging her and I not to let him go back to heaven, where he was. I couldn't bear it. My hands covered my eyes as if by hiding, I could make the last 3 months all go away. As Brian began to beat on the lid of his coffin, The girl spoke over him, sounding almost wistful. He won't find paradise or rest in hell. Neither of you will. But there is a sort of freedom there. One that Brian has no access to without your help. Even now, all these years later, I still can't understand why any of this had to happen. Not just to us, but to anyone. When I responded, my voice sounded like someone else's, coming out haggard as it became harder and harder to breathe. How do I know this isn't a trick? How do I know that... The girl simply said, "Open the coffin." "No!" Brian screamed from within the wood. "I don't want you to see me like this." The girl still had not blinked, nor had her eyes flickered from my face. "You know that I'm telling you the truth, Isabel. For you, damnation is your only salvation. His salvation. This entire time he has suffered. He will suffer less with me." "What do you get out of this?" I choked out. "What could our souls possibly mean to you?" "Not much. Not much at all." That cold hand brushed a lock of hair behind my ear. She remained impassive as I recoiled from her touch. She continued, "You'll be mere droplets in the ocean, absolutely indiscernible from the rest. Where you end and they begin, I won't recall, but you're still droplets that he doesn't get. Two baptized souls that I've stolen away from my father." She stopped to kneel in front of me, reaching to cup my chin. This time I didn't retreat. The girl, the devil, sounded earnest as she uttered, "I will never love you, not like how he does. But his love hurts you. It hurts all of you. Knowing what you know now, can you honestly say that his love is preferable to my neglect?" For the first time, I found some courage as I accepted the devil's help as she wrapped a hand around my forearm, aiding me in standing up. Once upright, I allowed her to lead me towards the coffin. In the meantime, Brian kept pounding at it. It loomed over me, more like a doorway than a casket. A door I was terrified to open. The devil then mirrored the same sentiment that the priest had before she'd brought me here. "If you forget to say goodbye, you'll regret it." From the other side of the wood, Brian begged me not to. Hesitantly, I set my shaking fingertips against the lid. Abruptly, the beating stopped. From the other side, I felt a soft thud against my palm. In my mind's eye, I saw Brian putting his own hand against mine, separated only by wood. "Don't open it, please," he whispered, sounding as if something had broken within him. My whole life it had been said that the devil is a deceiver, seeking to tempt and torment mankind with sin. It occurred to me that this whole thing could be a trick. A demon posing as my brother could be within that coffin instead of him. However, I also had been told that the devil would be a man and that heaven was a paradise. "I need to see you," I rasped, my voice coming out like it belonged to someone else. "I need to know for sure." Quietly, but enough to make my vision blur as it became overrun with more tears, Brian muttered, "It hurts." After a swallow and a shudder, I reached for the coffin's lid. I wish it had all been an elaborate trick after all. The mortician had tried. They used stitches to bring what was left of Brian's cheeks together. Shutting his eyes, closing the hole in his forehead where flies had already begun to nest, as if the more thread they used, the more they could erase the atrocity that had happened to him. How his body had sat by the side of an abandoned lot for weeks, unclothed and unnoticed until some kids had stumbled across it looking for a smoke spot. His skin moved with all the organisms that now lived inside of him, taking life from his dead flesh. As he silently reached forward to pull the coffin lid back over himself, I doubled over the nearest pew as the few bites of breakfast I'd been able to stomach that morning violently fought its way out of my mouth. The devil simply observed, the rosary swinging from her hand like a pendulum. "That's why I didn't want you to see." Brian sounded remorseful. The devil finally spoke again. "I regret to inform you that you're running out of time. You need to make a decision quickly." Staggering as my whole body shook at the memory of things squirming beneath Brian's bloated, splotchy cheeks, I approached the casket once again. This affected him the most. Heaven couldn't be heaven while he was trapped like this. "What do you want, Brian? Please don't make me go back." I pressed my forehead against the wood, wondering how the hell was I supposed to do this. If it's any consolation, once you join him, he won't be alone anymore. I believe this was the devil's attempt at providing some semblance of comfort. It was delivered in a deadpan tone with no trace of warmth on her face. There were so many other things plaguing my mind. An eternity of torment for both of us. And our parents. What about them? We'd never see them again. They'd be stuck in God's kingdom with Brian's killer. Bang! I jumped, whirling around. The church shook. Dust rained from the bricks as whatever was out there pounded on the wall. What followed was an outraged roar like metal gears grinding against each other, so high in pitch that I had to cover my ears. Once the roar finally subsided, the devil informed me, "The angels are coming." "That's an angel," Brian called through the casket. "Isabel?" "I'm all right," I assured him. But my frantic shout probably wasn't convincing. The devil was beginning to lose her patience as she told me once again, "You need to make a decision, now, or they'll take him back." The thing outside released another deafening cry. Stark white light began to flow through the windows. The grinding sound bounced a bit. A laugh. "Isabel." The devil said my name so firmly, with more power behind it than I have ever heard in my life, that I had no choice but to focus on her. All went quiet. Brian's shouts, the angels' attempts to batter down the church walls. It was just her and I. "Do it, take him, and tell him I love him." To this day, I don't know if the choice I made was the right one. But for the first time, the devil smiled. Then the wall broke, flooding the church in blinding light as the grinding made me want to crawl out of my skin. A hand seized mine. With a cry, I wrenched it away and stumbled back, unable to keep my legs below me as I scrambled away. "Isabel?" The voice was familiar. Not the devil, not Brian. The lights were back on. The priest who'd offered to walk with me was looking down at me with a mixture of concern and pity. At some point, I'd ended up on the floor. Mom had reemerged from the protective cocoon of Dad's embrace as they both rushed towards me in alarm. The church had gone silent as all who'd come to pay their respects watched in stunned sympathy. Only the somber organ music playing over the speakers remained. For years, I never told anyone about what happened for obvious reasons. It sounds like a grief-induced psychological episode, and for a while, that's what I told myself it was. But I remember every word from that visit from the devil. I remember exactly how it felt in her dark, imprisoning version of our family church. I recall that moment more profoundly than my wedding day, or when I held either of my newborn sons in my arms. Eventually, there came a time that I couldn't deny it to myself anymore, and I'd become morbidly curious about how many others were offered this deal. I began to reach out to other families who've gone through similar losses to what mine had. It turns out that the answer to that question is too many. This may sound silly, but those of us who've accepted the devil's offer have formed a little support group. We meet once a month. All of us know that there is nothing that can be done. It's just nice to be around others who get it. Others who've willingly damned themselves and their loved ones. If anyone listening this has ended up in a similar situation, I encourage you to DM me. I'll give you the details. You'd be amazed at how much it helps to be in a room of people that understand the terrible choice you had to make. While I can acknowledge now that this was a spectacular burden to place upon a teenage girl, I am glad that I was approached rather than one of my parents. It took years for Mom to smile again, and the stress of everything nearly sent my father to an early grave. As terrible as it sounds, I can't summon the courage to tell either of them about the deal. I know that it's wrong to keep something like this from them, but they comfort themselves with the idea of reuniting in heaven with Brian someday. How do you look your parents in the eye and tell them that you took their son away from them again? The guilt is the hardest thing to live with. Even though I know it was better than sending Brian back to where his tormentor was for all of eternity, I still question myself. Everyone in our group does, so I'll say it again. If anyone else has been approached by the devil, please reach out. You're not crazy. You didn't imagine it, and you don't have to deal with this alone. As I type this, I am dealing with a problem that hopefully no other person will ever have to contend with. To make things brief, there is a body in my closet. It's a male body. It has no clothes, no hair on its skin from what I can see, and the face appears to be embalmed in a way that gives it the appearance of a mannequin with its eyes sewn shut. I don't know how it ended up in there. A few days ago, as I was getting ready for work, I opened my closet door and found it laying on the floor, curled up with its arms wrapped around its legs. It doesn't smell, and it hasn't deteriorated any further from the original state that I'd discovered it in. Now, as you could imagine, I have reached a juncture. I live with a roommate and we both attend the same college. I intended to tell him about the body when I first discovered it, but I got cold feet because I realized this would probably end with him calling the cops on me and my life being ruined. So I didn't tell him, and at this point I don't know how I could tell him without the lapse of time incriminating me even further. I thought about dragging it out in the middle of the night and dumping in an alleyway or a dumpster, but that seemed like a risky thing to do, especially with all the parties that the neighbors seem to be throwing late into the night these days. It's still in my closet, and I had simply chosen to live with it for the time being. It was only supposed to be for a while, only until I had had all my bases covered and all of my T's crossed about it. I knew I'd have to deal with it eventually, but just not right now. Not right now. Not when I have so much going for me. I just got hired for the internship I'd been aiming for at the law firm of my dreams. I finally got the courage to ask out the cute barista at the local Starbucks, and we're on our third date. My savings have never been better, etc. I only wanted to have some peace before the inevitable storm on the horizon. Or so that was the idea. Last night, as I was studying for an exam that was scheduled in the morning, I heard a creak. It was quick and intentional, like the chirp of a bird. But I could tell immediately that it was the unmistakable peep of a rusty door being pushed open. My first thought was that I'd somehow forgotten to lock my bedroom door, and my roommate had mistakenly walked in on me. But as I panned across the room, I realized that, amongst the web of shadows that coated my walls, I could see the shimmering reflection of my white lamp etched into my locked doorknob. I was stunned for a second as the thought had crossed my head first before the impulse had reached my eyes. Slowly, and with the benign, tumorous thought of impossibility, my vision suddenly locked eyes with the streak of void that held my closet doors apart like a wedge. Was it the closet? I thought in silence. I knew that, had it been some faulty screw on its frame or a misplaced shoe on the floor that had simply caused it to gradually open until it made a sound, I would have dismissed it. However, I also knew that no matter how hard I tried to lie to myself at that moment, I couldn't reject the feeling that something was staring directly at me. And there was breathing, soft and rhythmical breathing in the darkness. I could hear the heavy beat of drums inside of my ears as I eventually panned down so that my traveling gaze finally reached its dead end at the floor. I couldn't believe my eyes. In front of me rested a single gray, ignominious arm poking out from the darkness. Its forearm remained as still as a dry earthworm in the moonlight, and its fingers curled upwards like the dead arms of a spider. The yellow nails of each fingertip were splintered in a way that caused them to resemble the decay of a smoker's rotten teeth. I stared at it for what must have been a minute at most, but it was a drunk and melancholic minute of time, and it would be forever incomparable to any other experience I had, or would have, ever experienced in my life. I tightly clutched my pen in one hand with droplets of sweat around my eyes. I was shivering with fear, and for a glimpse I could swear there was a boa constrictor wrapped around my heart and it was squeezing out all the blood. Though before I could do anything, there was a knock at my door. "Hey Josh, don't forget, you're on bathroom duty tomorrow." The untimely voice of my roommate pierced from the other side like a shotgun. Oh yeah. Sure, I stammered as I heard a grunt in response and the sound of footsteps turning in the other direction before walking away. By the time I turned to look back, the closet door had already been shut closed. I should have done something else, I realize now. But perhaps it was my innate aversion to conflict that forced me to bury my head in sand. I'm convinced now that that should have been my turning point, my breaking point, or whatever it's called. I should have told somebody, done something, other than procrastinate for even longer. But I once again decided that a lie would be preferable to the truth. But I was only coping, and I knew that I was only coping. Now it's only a matter of time until this gets out. Because this evening, as I returned home from work, I swear, looking from the outside, I could see a person's shadow standing in front of my bedroom window. I've seen some weird stuff in the woods. Here's the truth, this gear is nothing without me. My legs, my mind, my talent. That's what makes the magic happen. Sorry to everyone who bought the same shoes thinking they'd run like me. They won't. I posted this with a perfectly curated flat lay of my gear, a trophy positioned in the corner for motivation, and my lucky blue Brooks hat front and center. I hit share, exited the app, and waited for the notifications to start chirping. I knew they would. I've been trail running's poster child for years, living proof that grit and glory don't always come without a side of ego. You know the type, those of us, and sometimes the ladies, let's not be judgmental, who act like ultra trail running isn't just a lifestyle but a higher calling. Not everyone can handle it. And let's be honest, It takes a special kind of person to spend hours alone on trails, conquering terrain that would break most people in minutes. While others waste their weekends binge-watching TV, we're out grinding through miles of wilderness, proving we're tougher, faster, and more resilient than 99% of the population. This isn't just about running, it's about domination. It's about people like me, people who refuse to settle for mediocrity and need the world to know it. And what better way to let the world know than to post about it? So I did. Daily, actually multiple times a day. My feed was a mix of clothes, supplements, and medals. I stood tall and proud in the center of every photo, smiling wide, surrounded by my so-called minions. There were ambassador-branded salutes, a couple of posts supporting efforts to bring a missing female runner home, and plenty of coffee cheers sprinkled in for good measure. My feed was a science, and I had it perfected. I was training for a 100-mile trail race, the Madman 100. As egotistical, politically narrow-minded, and attention-seeking as some might say I am, people started to take notice when I posted about it. The Wahoos, a local run club, jumped into my comments, showering me with likes and invites to podcasts. My fan base on Insta and Strava started to soar. Training for an ultra is grueling, but I was thriving. By February, I had my routine locked in. Winter landscapes made for even better pictures. Running in shorts in sub-zero weather? That's the kind of grit that gets you reshared. One morning, after snapping a quick selfie, breath fogging the air, beard already dripping with icicles, I set off on a trail I'd run hundreds of times. The trailhead sign was littered with flyers, upcoming events, missing people notices, and hunting guide advertisements. I didn't bother reading them. Why would I? I knew the race is coming up, and they made for lousy selfie backdrops anyway. That morning felt like any other, until I saw her. In the distance, through the trees, a woman moved with an impossibly fluid gait, like she was floating over the uneven terrain. Other runners frequent these woods, but there was something about her. The way she seemed to vanish just as I thought I'd catch up. Her tracks were light and small, like a deer's. Her ponytail bobbed like a rabbit's tail, always disappearing just out of reach. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop looking for her. Every few days, I'd catch a glimpse of this phantom runner, her pink hat bouncing through the brush. Each time she stayed just beyond my grasp. I never saw her car in the lot, so she must have been using another access point. I started parking at different trailheads, running at odd hours, burning through PTO just to find her. Ultra running can be an obsession, and for me, it, or she, became all-consuming. The lack of sleep and relentless miles took their toll. My time slowed, my body ached, shin splints, blisters, frostbite. My beard grew shaggy, streaked with gray, and my eyes, wild, desperate, stared back at me in the rearview mirror. Madman 100 was less than a month away, and it was time to taper my training. Less time on the trails, unless I wanted to die trying. Then in early March, I saw her again. This time, she was closer, her form more defined. She stopped, waved, and disappeared into the trees. My heart pounded as I slammed my truck into park, leaving the keys inside. I knew these trails like the back of my hand. I sprinted to cut her off at the bridge. The mist clung to the forest, muffling my footsteps as I closed the distance. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Light in a forest can be uncanny, shifting and unnatural. As I moved, I noticed a creeping darkness on the trail. The bare limbs of the trees seemed to reach out toward me. High above, large black birds perched, watching my every step. At the cutoff, I finally closed in. Just ahead on the bridge was my trophy, the runner. Her whole figure was visible now, moving swiftly, her feet barely touching the ground. But as I approached, her form shifted unnaturally, bending and blurring like something out of a nightmare. Her pace wasn't a run or a walk, but a strange, erratic rhythm that both drew me in and filled me with dread. Suddenly, she flickered, like a poor TV signal, and then she was gone. When I reached the spot where she'd been, the truth hit me like a blow. She wasn't alive. She wasn't even human anymore. What I saw was a decayed corpse grotesquely entangled in the gnarled branches of an ancient oak. Her bright clothing was dulled by moss and dirt, the pink hat still clinging to her skull. She'd been there a long time, swallowed by the wilderness, forgotten. The only movement was the gentle swaying of her hair in the cold breeze. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. The woods were silent except for the pounding of my heart and the groaning of the trees in the wind. I turned and bolted toward my truck, my mind racing. Had this woman, this runner, ever really been there? Who had I been chasing all this time? I couldn't shake these thoughts as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Moving swiftly, I began to repeat the same words over and over in my head. Kip runs fast. Kip runs fast. But now the trails felt darker, the paths were overgrown, unfamiliar. Trees I didn't remember blocked my way. Mile markers were distorted, the numbers no longer logical. The woods stretched on forever. More than once I turned a corner and saw her again. Her sun-bleached hair still caught in the branches of that ancient tree. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. All I could hear was the cawing of the crows watching from above. I pressed on as night fell around me. Those who followed me saw the final post, a picture of me, huddled in a clearing of brambles, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The caption read, "I've been running forever. No end. She's still here. I'm still here." Trigger warning, suicide. I don't have many memories of my father's father, but he will always be burned into my mind. Most kids have fond memories of good times spent with their grandfather, but I never will. My grandfather, let's call him Bud, killed himself when I was a toddler. Bud was an angry alcoholic with a short fuse. My dad has told me horror stories of how him and his siblings would get locked in rooms while their dad flipped the main breaker on and off while screaming like a madman. Even though he did all of this horrific stuff, I've always been fascinated by him. I used to beg to spend the night at my grandma's house because I wanted to dig through his stuff to learn about him. I often wandered the property in hopes of seeing his ghost. The day he did the deed, it was unbelievably hot. Nobody found him for 3 days, so by the time my dad stumbled across him, he was pretty rotten. I remember one night at my grandma's, me and my cousin decided to stay up all night to try and summon him. We waited until midnight and went to the hall bathroom. We set up a few candles and turned the light off. The candles cast an eerie glow on the massive wall-to-wall mirror that set us on edge. We had seen movies and had heard about summoning stuff like Bloody Mary, so I was confident that we could summon Bud. We sat facing the large mirror and began to call his name. We sat there for what seemed an eternity before we decided to give up. Just before I flicked the light on, one of the candle flames started acting weird. It was moving like someone was trying to blow it out. There was no wind and the other flames were still. I suddenly asked if Bud was the reason behind the flame acting weird, and it began to grow. The flame started to grow like someone had started feeding propane into the wick. My cousin freaked out and darted out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Sometimes there was an issue with the door handle sticking and locking someone in. I reached for the knob, and sure enough, I was locked in. I began jiggling the doorknob like I had always done when this happened before. I'd become so focused on getting the door open that I was unaware of the candle flames. I realized that it had become brighter in the bathroom. I turned to look at the source, and all of the candles had roaring flames shooting from them. I walked over to the mirror and bent over to blow one out. When I stood back up, I saw him. In the corner of the bathroom behind me was my grandfather. His large frame towered in the corner of this tiny trailer bathroom. I jolted around, but he wasn't there. My hand flew to the light switch, but nothing came on. I looked back in the mirror, but he was gone. I began scanning the entirety of the bathroom's reflection to see if I could see him again. I hadn't realized it, but I had gotten my face just inches from the glass. Suddenly, Bud's face materialized in front of me. He looked just like his pictures. For a second, at least. His face began to fall as his mouth hung open. The back of his head exploded, leaving a pink mist to coat the bathroom. His eyes rolled back and his face began rapidly decaying. The sound of gunshots began ringing throughout the room. I was so scared that all I could do was hug my legs and bury my head in my knees. The next thing I remember is the bathroom door opening as my grandma and cousin came barreling in. The lights were already in, and my family looked at me like I had two heads before they scanned the room. With a confused look on her face, my grandma asked, "Who was in here with you?" I remember being confused at the question, but I responded that I had seen Bud. My grandma's face paled as she grabbed me off of the floor. She rushed us outside and into the car. We were miles down the road before anyone spoke. My cousin was the one that broke the silence by saying, "Why were you laughing after I left the bathroom?" "I wasn't," I responded in a sharp tone. "I saw Bud's face and then hit the floor," I explained. My grandma, who had been relatively silent since we left, began to explain what she heard from the other side of the door. Apparently, she heard me laughing uncontrollably, and she heard a man's voice speaking indistinguishable words. My cousin said that he ran out of the bathroom, expecting me to be right behind him. He heard the door slam and assumed I had done it after I ran out behind him. He realized that wasn't the case when he heard me laughing from inside the bathroom. He banged on the door, trying to get back in. My grandma woke from him banging. When she got to the door, she said she could smell cigarette smoke and heard a gruff male voice say, "Take the shot." I asked my grandma if the voice sounded like Bud. She said that it sounded like him if he was hoarse, but it sounded like multiple versions of the same voice talking in unison. She tried to hear what was being said, but when she heard the word suicide, she threw her shoulder into the door, and it opened. Years later, the old trailer was torn down and a new one was erected on another spot of the property. My uncle and his wife are the new residents. Every so often we have a family get-together at the new house. One night in particular, I had had a few drinks and was a little tipsy. I hadn't been in a bathroom on that property since the incident. I figured that I would be fine to use the bathroom since it was a new house. When I'm drunk, I sit to pee so as not to make a mess. As soon as I sat down, the lights flickered, and I heard a gruff voice in an almost demonic harmony say, "Take the shot." I jumped up off of the toilet, but before I could run out, I looked at the mirror to see Bud's desiccated, worm-eaten, rotted face smiling back at me, beckoning for me to join him. Lacey won the stuffed teddy bear at the local fair. She gave me the bear and I bought her a deep-fried slice of cheesecake on a stick in return. That must have been our first date. Maybe second if you count walking her home from class as a date. The teddy bear had always been here even when she wasn't, and she certainly wasn't here now. I tossed the bear up and up again, catching it over and over in my outstretched hands as I laid on my bed thinking about what I'd done wrong. Toss and catch, toss and catch, toss and catch. The smell of her perfume is embedded in the fluffy fur of the bear. She must have sprayed it when I wasn't looking. Toss and catch, toss and catch, toss and catch. Maybe I should have made more time for her. Maybe I should have sent her flowers. Maybe I could salvage this if I came up with a damn good apology. Maybe. Toss and catch, toss and catch, toss and catch. Maybe. The repetition and general emotional exhaustion lulled me into an unexpected sleep. The fragrant teddy bear lay nestled in the crook of my arm as I snoozed in a dreamless twilight with the light of my bedside lamp still illuminating the bedroom. Shifting slightly into a more comfortable position, the stuffed animal rolled away from my body and tumbled noiselessly over the edge of the bed and onto the carpet below. The slight change in pressure was just enough to pull me from my slumber. I rolled to the edge of the bed and reached down towards the floor to recover the bear, and hopefully return to sleep in only a moment's time. That's exactly how it would have happened, had I not laid eyes on a sight that made me feel more awake than every cup of coffee I'd ever ingested, combined. There, beside my own outstretched palm, was another that did not belong to me. Nor could it have reasonably been mistaken for mine. This hand, which stretched out from beneath the bedskirt, was gnarled with burl-like knuckles and long, gaunt fingers, adorned each with a cracked yellow fingernail. As I watched from atop the bed, the hand stretched slowly out until an entire spindly arm appeared. Flesh sagged about the bones within like Victorian drapery. It didn't occur to me that I should panic, so I didn't. I'd never been in a situation like this before. I wasn't entirely convinced I was in a situation like this right now, so the thought that I could scream or gasp or run away simply never entered my mind. The calloused fingertips clutched the teddy bear around his soft middle and pulled it rather gently across the carpet until it disappeared completely into the chasm behind the bedskirt. The faint smell of perfume lingered in the air. The now empty space beside the bed was filled with two simple words, "Thank you." The voice, which was almost a whisper, echoed slightly from below. Even then I did not panic. Then more than ever the soft sheets and doughy pillows called to me. I switched off the lamp and my mind, and fell quickly into a deep and restful sleep. The buzz of my cell phone awoke me the next morning. "Hello?" I yawned. The reply was far too loud and far too excited for whatever time it was. "Yo, wake up, I'm outside and I brought bagels." Brad was indeed outside, and he was, in fact, carrying a brown bag full of bagels in his hands. He settled at my kitchen table and explained that he had heard about Lacey, through a series of he said, she said type chains, and wanted to bring something he knew would cheer me up. Breakfast. Usually he would have been correct. Except I hadn't thought of Lacey yet that morning, and the mention of her name had the dual purpose of reminding me to be sad and disappearing any hunger I might have felt, not to mention that I had lost the teddy bear. My only tangible reminder of our relationship. Oh shit, the teddy bear. I ran from my kitchen table into my bedroom and threw up the bed skirt, hoping to see the stuffed toy on the carpet beneath the bed. Nothing. Crawling on my hands and knees around my room, I checked every conceivable stuffed animal-sized crevasse. Nothing. Brad watched from the doorway, half-eaten bagel in hand. "What you doing?" "You would not believe me if I told you," I replied. "Try me," he said. Realizing that I must already look insane, I conceded that I may as well sound it too. We returned to the kitchen table where I regaled him with a detailed account of my encounter with the creature. He listened intently, throwing in the occasional or "oh really" for encouragement. When I had finished my tale, I eyed him expectantly. "Dude," he said, "I mean this with, like, lots of love and stuff. I think you're just all tore up about Lacey and you had a nightmare. Or maybe it was one of those sleep paralysis demons or something, you know?" We talked back and forth for ages. I swore it was real. He was adamant that I was experiencing some nondescript form of psychosis. Eventually, he convinced me that I had binned the bear in a fit of rage and rationalized its absence in a nightmare about a monster under my bed, all as the result of my intense emotions over the breakup. Say what you want about Brad, but he's a solid amateur psychologist. Anyway, the entire episode was immediately forgotten when Lacey texted me later that evening. "I miss you." Lacey and I spent the next few months rekindling our relationship. The fair was on again, so we went and spent a bit of time making out at the height of the Ferris wheel. We went to the movies, to restaurants and bars, to parties, and of course we spent many a night at my apartment away from the prying eyes of onlookers who may sneer at our open affection. Things between us were perfect. Absolutely perfect. The type of perfection that can only be achieved when you blissfully and intentionally ignore each and every glaring issue for the sake of enhancing an illusion. She slammed the door of my apartment, setting the picture frames on the surrounding walls askew. "You're an asshole, Ben. Do not call me," she screamed from behind the closed door before storming down the hall and away from our relationship again. In that moment, I did the only thing I knew to do. I ran into my bedroom, threw myself onto my bed, and cried into my pillow like a princess locked in a tower. The sadness lasted an hour or so before it was replaced by red-hot anger. Her face, smiling at me from the framed photo on my nightstand, made my stomach bubble. I grabbed the frame and threw it onto the floor, hoping it would shatter into unrecognizable pieces. Hot tears streamed from the corner of my eyes into my sideburns as I stared at the ceiling, wishing a portal to space would open and suck me into the deep, black void, where I'd never have to worry about love or romance again. Minutes ticked by 1 second at a time as I pondered the void, only pulled back to my miserable reality by a voice in the dark. "Thank you," it groaned into the room where silence used to be. I threw myself across the bed and peered over the edge, just in time to see the corner of the picture frame disappear, pulled under by the very tips of 2 long fingers with 2 long fingernails. This time I remembered that I was a being with free will and, as such, I chose to panic. The tears on my face were replaced by cold sweat. The heaving sobs of moments ago were replaced by shallow breaths that did almost nothing in the way of oxygen circulation. My fingers wished desperately to flip the switch on my lamp and expel the menacing shadows from the room, but they were frozen in place, clasped tightly around my legs as I laid in the fetal position above the comforter for the following 6 hours or so. The next morning, when Brad arrived with bagels, I decided not to tell him about the picture frame, lest I be involuntarily committed to a psych ward. I'd searched beneath the bed on my own before his arrival, and discovered not a single remnant of the frame or the photo within. So really, what was there to say anyway? We ate our bagels, loaded as they were with heaps of cream cheese, in relative silence, punctuated occasionally by one or the other of us suggesting that I was better off without her anyway. This was true, of course. I was better off without her. Though I forgot that almost immediately as soon as she reappeared on my doorstep a few weeks later. The steam from the shower stuck to the mirror, which annoyed Lacey, who was trying to apply eyeliner in preparation for the wedding we were set to attend that evening. "What?" she asked. I pulled back the shower curtain to hear her better. "What?" She rolled her partially lined eyes. "What did you say a second ago?" I closed the curtain. I didn't say anything. She'd finished her makeup by now and was storming about the room like a whirlwind looking for this accessory and that. Ugh, she moaned. Where are my sandals? Have you seen them? I swear I left them right here next to the bed. She knelt down and searched the entire perimeter of the bed, even checking the small space between the bed frame and nightstand. No sandals. I shrugged. I haven't seen them, but we don't have time to keep looking. We should have left 20 minutes ago. Just wear your heels. She begrudgingly complied, and within 2 minutes we were off to drink too much and exhibit poor judgment in dance moves. That evening we stumbled through the front door, releasing one tee-hee and ha-ha after another into the dark apartment. We staggered towards the bed, shedding high heels and neckties along the way before collapsing into a puddle of giggles and fits. It was so nice to see her smiling. I didn't want her to stop for even a moment. I reached out to tickle her. Her laugh rang out like a wind chime as she reached to push my hands away. "Come on, Ben," she gasped between cackles. "Stop." I can't breathe. I intended to stop after just another moment, but before I did so, she wiggled out of my grasp and popped over the side of the bed. She landed on the carpet with a dull thud. I rolled onto my back and clutched my stomach, which shook from the force of escaped laughter. It took a moment for me to quiet down enough to realize that she wasn't laughing anymore. "Aw, Lacey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" The words caught in my throat as I leaned over the bed to help her up. The hand again. I recognized the bulging knuckles, this time clutched firmly around her ankle. She stared silently as I did, tears welling in her wide eyes, as the face of the creature emerged from beneath the bed. Its saggy flesh hung about the face in sheets. Its pallid eyes, sunken deep within the skull, were set firmly on Lacey. It did not turn to look at me as it spoke. "Thank you." She let out a partial scream before she was dragged almost in one motion beneath the bed and out of my life forever. Of course, I searched desperately for any trace of her in the void beneath the bed, though I knew by now that what was taken by the creature was taken completely. I can only hope that, wherever she is hugging the stuffed teddy bear and thinking of me. I lived in an old-fashioned neighborhood in an old-fashioned town as a kid, not befitting of the 21st century. It must have looked like something out of a vintage magazine advertisement at one point, but a coat of decay had been painted over everything. Unwieldy plant life clung to every building. There were burned-down houses nobody ever bothered to rebuild. There were closed buildings nobody ever bothered to reopen. It was the perfect place to live if you were a child with a preference for exploration or an elderly person with a preference against it. Everyone in between didn't much care for it. It was spring break and I was broken. Broken in the left arm specifically. That's the price one pays for exploration. I'd bumped my cast on the guardrails around the stairs that led to the church's entrance that day. Time passes slowly when you're that age, when you've only lived through 9 springs. You're not good at waiting. Waiting for your arm to heal is like waiting for the second coming of Christ, which the service that day was about. Another boy a year older than me noticed the cast. "Are you letting people sign that?" "I don't know. I've seen it in movies and on TV. People let their classmates sign their cast." "You're not my classmate." "Donnie, we've done Sunday school together. Just let me sign it. When'd you get it anyway?" "If you'd been paying more attention, you'd know it was 2 weeks ago." He started signing it without waiting for affirmation. He had a red crayon on hand. His signature read, Ben, if one can call it a signature. It was closer to print. He hadn't figured out a fancy way to write his name yet. "I'm trying to heal right now. It's hard for me not to be able to do stuff. My family's preying on it." "That ain't gonna work. You want to know what really works?" "It will too work. Don't say things like that near the Lord's house." He could tell he'd offended me, so he backed off. It was a week later and many other signatures had huddled up next to his. I could feel no progress in my arm. It was just as broken as ever, so I decided to approach him about it. "We've been praying for my arm to heal and nothing has happened yet. It still feels the same." "I told you it wouldn't work." "I wanted to ask you about that. What does work?" He leaned in and shifted his lower jaw around in anticipation. "If you want to get something healed, you gotta go to the real God, not the fake one. The fake God's in there." He pointed to the church. "The real God's in the well." "Why?" "Because it's where people don't expect him to be." "What well?" "Taylor's well." "Where's that?" "You'll have to talk to Taylor. I can take you to him." I told my parents I was going off to play with a friend. They were permissive when it came to that sort of thing. Ben and I bothered insects walking through weeds and flowers, hopped over creeks, and walked down roads I'd never used until I realized we were back in my own neighborhood. It was simply a part of it I never visited. A dead-end street hidden under the curve of a hill and behind a curtain of intrusive trees. The sidewalk started and ended where it shouldn't. Weeds and grass blades erupted out of the cracks between each cement rectangle, and the street looked like some giant had taken a hammer to it. Houses that may have once been homogeneous were now individuated by different degrees of decay and abandonment. It was everything I recognized about the town distilled into one area. I heard a dog barking at us from somewhere. Ben decided to reassure me. "Don't worry. He's trapped behind a fence. He can't kill you or nothing." He gestured to a decrepit one-story house with a "Beware of Dog" sign outside. "Does he want to kill me?" Ben realized he'd said the wrong thing and stopped himself from doing it again. "Don't you worry about nothing. We're close to God anyways." He brought me to the least unkempt house in the area and rang its doorbell. Another boy opened the door. He was older and huskier than either of us. His eyes went to my cast as soon as he got a look at me. "Come in." His house was a mess. A dog, less threatening than the one outside, sat amidst a mound of stuffing it had ripped out of some unfortunate pillow. The trash bag in the kitchen was overflowing, and things that shouldn't be anywhere but in a trash bag were all over the floor. Nothing looked like it had been swept, dusted, or vacuumed in years. I had to ask a question. "Do you live here alone?" "Much of the time." "Do you have parents?" "Some of the time." "You've healed people before?" He has, the God in the well. Every kid in the area with a physical problem finds their way here eventually. The word always reaches them. God works in mysterious ways. Ben decided to wedge himself into the conversation. "Taylor and I go way back." They weren't old enough to go way back unless they knew each other as babies. Ben had probably heard that phrase from someone else and not understood it. I knew what he was getting at, though. "Where's the well?" "The house next to this one. Nobody lives there." We headed into his backyard. The grass was high enough to be irritating to walk through. An unused lawnmower rusted near the door. Taylor turned to us. "We're hopping the fence." And so we did. I'd hopped fences before, but not with a broken arm. We were taken to a different yard, a larger yard that was given even more to the wild. Fences separated it from the dead-end street, but not from the woods that crept behind it. A ways out from the house behind us was a well, the sort of thing you didn't see often outside of old-fashioned neighborhoods in old-fashioned towns. This is where God is, under the ground, in the well. Not many grown-ups know this. It's a secret. And you've got to swear not to tell any of them about this place. Not unless they're desperate enough to heal a child that you can trust them. They'd build a church over it. They'd sing and drive and hammer nails and make an awful lot of noise. The God in the well wouldn't like this. The last 10 or so steps I had to take toward the well were more difficult than the rest of the journey so far. What happened to the version of me a week ago who'd shut down Ben for speaking blasphemy? Now the well was within my sights. What if God wasn't in the well? What if God, who was in the church, decided to damn me for not trusting him? But he hadn't healed my arm yet. As far as my child mind was concerned, no progress had been made despite praying on it every day. Walking up to it couldn't hurt. Looking in couldn't hurt. A circle of bricks, a triangular prism roof, and a bucket dripping from a rope. It was unremarkable, just as worn by weather as the house it hid behind, as the rest of the dead-end street. My legs moved as if it were they, not my arm, that were injured. Ben put his hand on my shoulder and offered a warning. "Don't go any further unless you're sure, unless you believe." The call to believe forced more doubt into my head. Taylor was less patient than Ben. Either walk up to the well or don't. What do I do after I walk up to it? You wait. That's what you do. I got close enough to look down the well into the dark. I couldn't see the bottom of it. Its roof curtained it with a shadow that no shimmer managed to tear through. I didn't like looking into the well. I couldn't stop imagining myself falling into it or imagining Taylor pushing me in. Taylor began to instruct me. "You have to wait by the well. Wait until nightfall. It could take hours. My parents will be upset with me if I don't come home. They'll be happier that you'll have your arm back." Was it a trick? Was it a joke? If so, I could make it back home fast enough. I'd figured out the way back. It's not as if I didn't know where I was. I invented explanations in my head while I sat by the well. explanations that sounded less sacrilegious. I'd later learn that Ben called my parents to say I was at his house, and Taylor called Ben's parents to say Ben was at his house. There weren't many streetlights here. Night was night. I could see the stars, but everything else radiated darkness, the kind of darkness that threatened to swallow me up. I'd gotten over my fear of the dark, but this was a new context, a context that wrestled that particular fear back into the open. Crickets and the occasional barking dog scored the experience from a distance, saved me from potentially maddening silence. I had no way of knowing how late it was. A spider crawled across the edge of the well. Without thinking twice, I flicked it inside, let it fall into the darker still pit. I was tempted to doze away. I might have, because after a slow blink I heard a voice. I heard it the same way I hear voices in my dreams, and not in the way I hear them while awake. Donnie, Donnie, Donnie. I looked around and said all I could think to say. That's my name. It is my name too, for all names are mine to take as I see fit. The voice echoed from behind and below me, from the bottom of the well. Are you going to heal me? First you must pray to me. I pray that you will heal me, amen. Nothing happened. Why didn't you heal me? That wasn't good enough. But those were the rules. You were insincere. This answer did not satisfy me. He'd stepped around my concern. I decided to sweeten things up. I decided to think about how happy I would be, how happy my family would be, even were I to return home with a fully healed arm. I stopped thinking and spoke. God in the well, I come before you as your humble servant. I give you my left arm so that you may please heal it. Amen. You try to prove your sincerity now? I'm new to this. You must jump into the well. Why? To prove yourself. Jump. Doing so will not harm you in the way that you imagine. Will I land on you? I have no body. Not yet. It's why your kind have not discovered my kind. There is nothing for you to land on. I felt something akin to a harsh wind urging me into the well. I could not resist it, and so I fell. I fell for what felt like hours. I passed through some liquid so dark that it didn't shine in the moonlight, passed through it soaking wet, and continued falling until I dried, and a harsh light came at me from below and I crashed into it, finding myself outside the well as the sun rose. I tore off my cast because I could feel the difference. My left arm had healed. Light either seemed to reflect from or radiate off of it, at least for a moment before dissipating. I had witnessed my first miracle. My parents couldn't believe it. Who would? They'd known that I'd authentically broken my arm, though. They settled on the explanation that a miracle had occurred, that their prayers for me had been answered. I didn't tell them about the God in the well. My arm, which ordinarily felt fine, began to experience a cramping, burning sensation every time I attended church with my family. The sensation would come when I entered the doors and leave when I exited. I could tolerate it, though. It's not like I needed my left arm at church. Taylor insisted it was because God had marked my arm and false places of worship rejected it as such. Ben and I recommended the God in the well to more people. Taylor felt that if enough children came to understand where to look for God, the next generation would achieve greater spiritual elevation. We'd have special knowledge our parents' generation didn't. There was a boy named Stephen who broke his nose. There was a girl named Janet who suffered from a swollen spleen. There was a boy named Jamie who had the worst case of strep throat I'd ever seen. Every time we brought someone to the well, I was amazed. Some of them didn't even attend the local church, so I didn't imagine they experienced the pain I did when I attended. Years passed, and I ended up attending a college within driving distance. I wasn't attending church anymore. I was able to put the God in the well out of my mind during my freshman year. The fact that Janet attended the same college was the only thing that occasionally caused me to reminisce. I'd explain none of it to my roommate Malik. I'd like to think that if he suffered an injury or came down with a terrible illness, I might have. But in reality, I was embarrassed, and his good health was simply an excuse not to sound crazy in front of him. It wasn't until my sophomore year that the hunger began. A strange kind of hunger. It radiated from my left arm rather than my stomach, but hunger is all I know to call it. The pangs were at first hard to distinguish from the sort of sensation one feels when one's muscles are reconstructing after exercising them, but it became clear to me that it was something else. My arm was marked by the God in the well and hungered to return there. I experienced flashes of the well, awake and asleep, and salivated. It was a place, not a food, I hungered for. I'd never experienced anything like it. I ran into Janet on campus one night. Or rather, she went out of her way to run into me. Her eyes bugged toward mine. You feel it too, don't you? The hunger. I did. We'd both thought to call it the same thing. Yeah. You know what we have to do, right? We have to go back to the well. I'd considered it. So that settles it. We go together Sunday. I didn't object. She was set on it. When Sunday came around, the two of us hopped into her car and headed to my old neighborhood. I didn't have to provide her with instructions. She knew where she was going. He was hungrier than I was. I could tell that much. Maybe it's just harder to ignore when it's coming from your spleen. She explained herself during the ride. At first I thought I just needed food. I stuffed myself, but it didn't work. The hunger persisted. I didn't feel it in my gut because I needed food. I felt it in my gut because that's where I was marked. I need to see the well again. What if it's not like we remember? We were just kids. I don't care if it's like we remember. I need to see it. The dead-end street was in an even greater state of disrepair than I'd last seen it by the time we arrived at 6 p.m. that night. Jumping fences gets easier as you get taller, but harder as you get heavier. I was thankful to have developed in a lanky direction. As soon as we'd hopped the fence, Taylor was there to greet us. It had been several years since I'd last interacted with him, but had no difficulty recognizing him. He spoke up. We'd been waiting. He led us further into the backyard. A campfire was situated on a patch of earth so that its sparks did not reach the wild grass. It stabbed at the air, and its crackles overpowered the chorus of crickets I remembered attending every past visit to this place. Ben, Stephen, and 3 other young adults I didn't recognize sat around it. Stephen turned toward us. He couldn't stop rubbing his nose. You got the hunger, we all did. It seems like it's only those of us who've come of age too, none of the kids. We're missing Jamie, I inserted. We're waiting, responded Ben. There are at least 4 more people who should be here. You ain't met them all. One by one, we waited as more people arrived. Some came by car and others walked. Jamie, who winced as he rubbed his neck, arrived last. It was 9 p.m. and we were all hungry. Taylor took charge. Everyone get around the well. We did as he said. He seemed to be more familiar with the well than any of us were. The fire went out of its own accord, but my arm felt hotter than I could have ever imagined, as if I were being scalded from the inside out. It radiated light, as did Janet's gut, Stephen's nose, and so on. I could see which body part had been healed by the god in the well on each of the young adults who surrounded me, but was in too much pain to pay attention. Then, as if amputated by an invisible blade, my left arm detached itself from my body. Light flashed and skin bubbled over the wound. It was a bloodless process. I collapsed in shock as my arm wormed its way to the well. I saw legs, arms, a nose, a throat, a torso, each becoming an independent organism and crawling into the well. I was fortunate enough to have lost a non-vital part of my body. Janet, Jamie, and a few others who I didn't know by name weren't so fortunate. I couldn't move. I had no means by which to emotionally grasp what had just happened to me. By the time I managed to sit up, I saw something emerging from the well, cobbled together from the various body parts acquired. It was almost human.